Hi everyone. How does one get to know someone? How does one get to know themselves? How does one communicate? These are the opening questions to this month's retrospective on Argento Soma. Sorry I didn't leave this one to a poll, I just really wanted to talk about Argento Soma, a very unique mecha anime that, while embodying some tropes of the genre, does so in a way to make the approach to each of these stand out here, as well as cement the piece as an underrated gem. It's not perfect, no, as it is a little clunky at times and the production budget is not the highest, but it has heart and interesting characters, dang it, so it's risen up the ranks in my eyes, and it's also directed by the same guy who directed The Big O, which, that also helps. I also find some of the clunk charming. Argento Soma's bizarre decisions are many, including centering on, and somehow succeeding, at getting us to emphasize with an angsty and at times unlikable edgelord, co-starring a character that doesn't talk for 75% of the series, Frank, setting up multiple plot threads just to discredit them via big plot twists, and many more. And all of this works. Getting into some specifics, Argento Soma tells the story of an edgelord on a misguided revenge quest, a traumatized girl, an illiterate, for the most part, robot, some military randos, and one of the most underrated waifus of all time, teaming up to stop possibly not really evil aliens from somewhere doing something meeting up in Canada. While this may sound a little vague, I want to save the plot twist for the brief plot summary and assure you it is all technically correct. Sidetracking back to my personal relationship with the series, Argento Soma is something I had heard about in passing before, and even seen a while back, but it's something that I'd really never got to know before rewatching it for this retrospective. As a product of the very late 90s and early 2000s, it aired in 2000-2001, it is among the last of the hand-drawn pre-digital animation wave of mecha, and a great ambassador of it. Yes, it still has some obtuse moments and the expected animation quirks, inconsistency, of a mid-budget hand-animated production, but it's genuinely great, and the localization is actually pretty nice too, especially by the standards of the day. In fact, on the topic of localization, Argento Soma is close to me because it's one of the most American anime I've seen, uniquely so, and for that reason feels bizarrely comforting or familiar to me, and I imagine perhaps other American members of the audience. That's not to say that this series is full of American stereotypes or was even made by or for Americans, but that in universe, most of the cast is American, and most of the show takes place in the United States, with a portrayal that is pretty realistic and subtle. There's no fun, typical hyper-American character we see in anime as a big character, there's no Bandit Keith or anything, and while stuff like that would have been fun, I understand that the averageness of everyone here is part of the charm of the series. They don't talk about the flag or guns constantly, and they aren't super gung-ho or arrogant or outgoing as Americans in anime tend to be, but just feel like random people you might actually read about and perhaps even meet. It's a very respectful and humble approach to setting up a cast of, to a Japanese audience, foreigners. I don't know the reason for this creative decision, other than perhaps trying to replicate the success that the Big O had in the West, but that, and the older ages of the cast, at least by typical anime standards, as most everyone here is in their 20s and 30s, give Argento Soma a grounded level of reliability that I wasn't expecting and that we don't see a lot in anime. An animated production has so much ground for bizarre and unrealistic elements that having a cast that actually feels like real people and is like the age of many real people, realistic adults doing adult stuff, is bizarrely comforting. Argento Soma is literally more mature than many other anime both back then and even now. The setup is fantastical and science fiction, but the people are mostly just somewhat average Americans, like I like to assume both I and most of my audience. It's really cool because there isn't this nagging thread we see of in a lot of anime, like, he looks 25 but is 16 and this makes it less realistic, like Jotaro or something. No, it feels like an actual story about actual, if at times immature, adults growing past their formative years, and it's proof that not all anime needs to star fantastic youth, and that we can still do stuff with our lives past 35. It gives the series a grounding we don't see a lot of in this genre, manifesting in such things as measured discussions, and an entire episode essentially dedicated to a boardroom meeting, something which feels realistic. On age, Argento Soma can be identified as a product of its time, but it generally doesn't feel too dated. There is a mostly superficial attempt at edge, but this doesn't affect the surprisingly wholesome tone of the series, and it's overall pretty timeless, with just enough 90s angst to come off as unintentionally cute. I can definitely see why it's a cult classic, and had it had better distribution and a few lucky breaks, I wouldn't be surprised if it was much more remembered and talked about today. I genuinely love the series, and even as I tried to search for objective flaws in it, most things that stuck out were simply kind of weird and quirky, and executed well enough where I don't really think they stand out as flaws, and just more features. It feels a little raw at times, but I can definitely see the vision, and it's a rather beautiful and charming series. Definitely enough to coat over any rough edges here and there. And yes, I know that this is something that came out around the time Evangelion did, but look guys, not every anime between 1995 and 2005 is an Eva clone just because it has giant robots and maybe aliens. You can compare Evangelion to a lot of things, yes, but I hope people realize that Evangelion is not the be-all end-all, especially considering that it in and of itself is a mishmash of different inspirations combined with Anno's own depression. But this video is not about Evangelion, it's about Argento Soma, one of the most underrated and spirited pieces of the time, a bizarre constellation of memorable characters, unique concepts, great themes, a few twists, some production quirks, and just enough rough edges to make it a charming classic to any mecha anime catalog, and help it serve as an overall excellent rearguard to the older generation of hand-drawn 90s animation before making way for the more refined and consistent digital stuff we would see in the 2000s. Plot time. As with all plot summaries on this channel, please note a few caveats. This is only intended to be a very loose summary, something that can paint a vague picture of the plot without getting into too many details. I'd like to leave some twists and unexpected moments for anyone who actually wants to watch the show themselves, so please forgive if I leave out your favorite details, and please consult specific character notes and sections if you would like more about those characters specifically. Let's begin. Argento Soma takes place in a world beset by an alien invasion. Now I say it like this for reasons we'll get into later. In this timeline, first contact resulted in the deaths of many as aliens walked through cities and caused great collateral damage. Since then, the Earth has been on constant alert and seeks to stop the aliens from their goal of getting the Pilgrimage Point, a seemingly barren location on the Canadian plains. What happens if they get there? No one really knows because they haven't let it happen yet, but it could be bad, or so everyone fears. Anyways, the show stars Takuto, later Ryu Soma, please note I will use these names interchangeably, who is a university student dating Maki. While the two seem to have a troubled relationship, Takuto does seem to care for her, kind of I guess, even if that manifests in a lot of toxic behaviors at times. Out of respect for this, he agrees to help her with her research, resurrecting an alien robot under the care of the shadow organization Morgue, led by the rogue Dr. Noguchi, Ernst Noguchi. The resurrection, though, is sabotaged by the military, and Frank, the robot, tries and fails to shield Maki from falling debris, something Takuto misinterprets as him trying to kill her, and paints his ill perception of Frank for the rest of the series. Anyways, Takuto ends up in the hospital as a result of the accident, and we next cut to Frank, who flees to the mountains of northern Montana. Here, he saves a young girl named Harriet, Hattie, from these guys. Harriet is able to understand Frank and communicate with him due to a piece of alien metal lodged directly into her brain, and she sees him as a protective fairy. Frank goes along with this as he generally seems to want to protect her. Soon though, Funeral, an anti-alien task force, closes in on the location and whisks away Harriet, whom Frank whisks away in an attempt to protect her. This leads to an incident in the city, where a now scarred Takuto sees Frank and vows revenge. As such, he accepts an offer from the mysterious Mr. X to get a new ID and join the anti-alien task force at Funeral as the, quote, former Alaskan pilot Ryu Soma. Again, I will use Takuto and Ryu interchangeably. The core of Funeral is the Mobile Funeral Task Force, consisting of a wing of Zargs, advanced mechs flown by the best pilots of Funeral, and secretly constructed using parts from dead aliens. Meanwhile, Frank, and by extension Harriet and her dog Walden, are captured by Funeral, who hold on to Frank for research. However, when it's noticed that Frank actually listens to Harriet, an idea is hatched to use her as a handler to control Frank in battle. From here, the team slowly comes together, as Funeral at first begrudgingly uses Frank to fight other aliens via Harriet's instruction, and then begins to trust and even protect both of them more and more. Ryu also joins the team at this point and meets Team Commander Michael Heartland, Ace pilots Dan Simmons, Guinevere Green, and Sue Harris, and Mission Commander Lana Iness. He also meets Harriet, and their interactions slowly start to help Ryu recognize his toxic behaviors, and maybe he hates himself and his past actions, and not necessarily Frank. All is not well though, as in the midst of this, Ryu still tries to carry out his misguided revenge at Frank, something which he comically fails at multiple points, and falls into anguish as the greater good often forces them to work together. During all of this, he is smuggling information to Mr. X. Also, Funeral straps a hydrogen bomb to Frank's neck for, quote, security purposes, and openly discusses using it a few times, although most of these attempts fail because Commander Heartland refuses to do so. For the one time he did agree, because he thought everyone was going to die, the bomb's revealed to be a fake. Anyways, from this point in the series, about the 5th or 6th episode, we enter into a series of Monster of the Week episodes punctuated by a new type of alien and some sort of emotional development, whether it be Harriet learning to deal with her PTSD, Ryu working his way through his conflicted feelings, Iness moving past the loss of her daughter, Dan learning to tolerate Ryu and mend the relationship he has with his father, or something else. Along the way, Frank also technically dies, although he is successfully resurrected in the old morgue lab, and it is here where, after hearing a recording of Maki, Takudo begins to realize that perhaps Frank didn't mean to hurt her. This is confirmed after a bunch of big turns where 4 big reveals are made. 1. Nothing happens if the aliens actually make it the pilgrimage point. 2. All the aliens head here because it is the old home of cosmic explorer Yuri Leonov. 3. Frank and the aliens are actually just weird space mutations of Yuri Leonov, who was transformed into them by a mysterious cosmic event in deep space. And 4. Mr. X is actually a good guy who wants to get revenge on the military for getting his friend Yuri into this mess in the first place. And he's also Guinevere's dad and bails the funeral unit out a few times. This is also the point where Ryu finally starts to accept that Frank was actually trying to protect Maki, and Frank regains enough higher brain function not only to remember how to talk in full paragraphs and remember that he was Yuri Leonov, but get a completely new voice as well. However, upon regaining his higher brain functions and a new voice, Yuri falls into a despair at learning his wife died in an alien-adjacent incident and shuts down at the grief of having inadvertently killed his wife. There is no time to mourn though, as Pilgrimage Point is soon nuked by military forces, still unaware and afraid of the quote alien threat. This sets up the final confrontation between Funeral and the army, who seeks to forcibly disband and supersede the private unit. Funeral emerges victorious though. All of this, however, seems moot, as it takes place as an alien the size of Earth nears the planet and threatens to literally tear it apart with its own gravitational field. Nothing humanity possesses can seem to stop it, even the hydrogen bomb-armed Ulysses space station, whose use could cause serious negative effects even if successful. To stop this and its possible consequences, Mr. X hacks into the government, forcing them to wait while sending out tons of incriminating files about their unscrupulous past to the world. Now, he is killed for this, allegedly. I think he shows up in the final episode or something at some point past this somehow, but he does take satisfaction in helping bring down the corrupt organizations that got Frank/Yuri into this mess in the first place. Meanwhile, this stalling works long enough for an unresponsive Frank to be roused by Ryu's epiphany that he never listened well to others, and that's why his relationship with Maki was always troubled. Ryu learns that to some extent he was the problem, and that he hates himself and his own faults, not Frank or really anyone else for this reason. He was just never able to listen to both others and himself in such a way to learn this important epiphany, and having learned it, helps Frank remember the human spirit. As such, to honor both his late wife and all the friends he's made along the way, Frank then gathers every alien particle on Earth and in orbit, remember they're technically all part of him, and assumes his heavenly final Frank form. From here, thanking everyone in an emotional farewell, he flies off into space in order to stop the massive alien heading towards Earth, which he does, at seemingly the cost of his own life. The final episode then takes place 6 years later, where we get to see what happened to most of the cast and the final event in the timeline. Sue and Dan got married. Ryu went to jail for espionage. Gwen died. Iness became world president or something like that, and Harriet and Heartland are set to fly off into deep space to talk to the newest version of Frank, a massive nebula heading towards Earth. However, at the final minute, a now pardoned Ryu joins them, and they all seek not only to remind Frank who he is, but also to save the Earth once again. Not with weapons this time, but with dialogue. Now that the plot summary has concluded, I want to do a quick conspiracy summary. You see, throughout Argento Soma, there are inklings of some kind of great conspiracy tying everything together and making a lot of the little loose ends kind of make sense. But I say inklings because while we're plainly told of Frank's backstory, how much of that is connected to the current motives of the world military here and the current actions of other non-alien forces is kind of murky at best. I mean, I can't confirm much of what I want to say here, although I feel like the series does imply most of it, and the fact that I got this kind of coherent picture out of it does seem to hint that there was either an attempt at executing this grand behind-the-scenes story that either didn't quite make it all the way through in the production process, or simply wasn't elucidated enough to really be the most impactful. I will say that this is probably an objective flaw of the series, although if you really want, you could just chalk it up to suspenseful and mysterious writing. And in my head it makes sense, but I do say that I feel I lack substantive evidence to prove this 100%. Now, this theory is that Dr. Noguchi wants to bring an alien back to life in order to try and communicate with it and stop the, quote, invasion. This, however, is stopped by the military, who fear losing their current status in the world, and, more importantly, fear that an alien capable of communicating will expose their cover-up of Yuri's fate. Their cover-up of the fact that he is the aliens the whole time, and that they are guilty of gross negligence. This leads to the sabotage of the morgue facility, presumably under the command of Colonel Kilgore, I think I hear his voice in this scene, and Takedo's arc. They do fail to stop this process though, and as such, they keep Frank in funeral custody to at least keep him under tabs and probably hope that he will be destroyed in a battle. Prompting possible destruction in battle would also serve as an ulterior motive for putting the bomb on Frank's neck. This scheme fails, however, when the funeral team thinks of ways to creatively fight, and later on, when I have no real evidence for this other than a feeling, when David Lawrence somehow replaces the bomb with a dummy. This might also explain why David Lawrence has Ryu act as a spy, not because he actually wants to hurt Frank, but because he needs someone to keep tabs on him and feed him dirt on the command, which I assume is among the files that he has Ryu sent him. Although, I don't know why he would have Ryu do this when he already has contacts with Guinevere, although maybe he just actually helped her out of actual family bonds, and not because he wants to actually use her as he uses Ryu. Getting kind of back on point though, if Ryu was to send David Lawrence all of these classified files, I don't know how Ryu himself doesn't figure out who Frank actually is, but I guess we can overlook that. Anyways, this conspiracy to kill Frank would also explain why a military Zarg attempts to intercept him on the way to be resurrected at the morgue facilities, and why the military assumes direct command afterwards, seeing the revived and communicative Frank/Yuri as too much of a threat to be left alive. By this point though, David Lawrence has already emailed the dirt on these people to the world, and Frank leaves it to save it anyways. Thus, the conspiracy kind of concludes as those who are guilty of it are exposed, and the victim of it heads back into space anyways. Now, I can't confirm any of this, but it seems to be some kind of attempt at a greater plot we just don't see 100% fleshed out. Argento Soma is a series I love for its authenticity and almost undercooked aspects. Like a rare steak, you can see where the product was perhaps not cooked as much as possible, but it's still undeniably great. I see heart in it, and all of its little quirks are extremely charming to me, intentional or not, even if at times questionable. One might say that the lack of noses in certain shots is an oversight, or a sign of skill shortage. I call that an avant-garde moment born out of, I'm assuming, a tight budget and timetable. One might question suddenly giving Frank a very human and professional voice. I am all for that. One might question why a show about communication stars an objectively unpleasant man. I say that's a credit to the show's ability to rope you in and explore its themes. One might question why a show about an alien invasion reveals it's not about an alien invasion only halfway through. I think that's an intentional setup and payoff. It's all of these quirks, intentional or not, that give Argento Soma its very quaint and genuine feel. It feels like something we don't see anymore simply because it is something we don't see anymore. A production where the confluence of good effort, weird ideals, and perhaps limited production resources all come together to remind us that mecha anime as a genre tends to be much more about the people in the mechs than the mechs themselves. In an age where visuals are easier than ever, if perhaps pricier, I love stuff like this where the shows are kind of forced to have substance to gloss over any technical oversights. Argento Soma is undeniably weird, though I would consider that to be my favorite aspect of it. While I see technical hiccups as just that, there are other much more intentional aspects of the series' construction setting it apart, and I think they work really well. Those are namely its choice of protagonists, and how closely they and their character arcs mesh together to support the main theme of communication. Argento Soma doesn't have a conventional protagonist. Instead, it kind of has three protagonists that each cover different bases, but all in some way embody the importance of communication and kind of learning to forgive yourself and others and moving past traumas. Takado is the quote main character in the sense that he's the focus of the show. However, his character growth is rather mediocre at best by design, and he's never really that likable, at least for me. I could understand someone sympathizing with this guy because he does have a painful backstory. However, what we see beyond that does prove that he was kind of a douchebag anyways, and the character growth isn't really enough to overcome that in my eyes. Now, I still think he's fascinating because he was consciously designed like this. I just don't think he's the most relatable. However, he is the main protagonist simply because he is the guy on the cover and does get the most screen time. Harriet serves as the closest thing to a conventional protagonist in my eyes, as she actually has a solid character arc and a lot of character growth, in addition to doing a lot of plot-relevant stuff, although it's obvious that she is more of a complementary protagonist than a primary one. Finally, Frank is arguably the most heroic in a conventional sense, as he makes tons of sacrifices for others and always conducts himself in a noble fashion, though his lack of speech for more than half of the series means that we do grow to like him and understand that he's good pretty early on. We cannot quite parse all of his thoughts for a good part of the series, and that there is a literal disconnect between him and us. Now, I do like the construction of this weird cast of protagonists, because none of their roles really overlap with each other, and this means that they don't really step on each other's toes. They all feel unique, and they all cover different bases, meaning they mesh together surprisingly well, and do help embody the ideas of the series overall. I think that this is one of the first series that I've ever seen where the main protagonist is often portrayed as openly unlikable and disagreeable, who refuses to learn for most of the series and is just kind of a jerk. Takado/Ryu is very immature, irritable, and borderline nihilistic at times. He's never social, he mopes, he crashes out, and he even seems to dislike most everyone around him a lot of the time, and he's just kind of a jerk. And yet he never crosses the line into melodramatic or satirical for me, and he never crosses the line into being insufferable to me. It's really bizarre and really impressive, and that while I was never rooting for him, I did objectively kind of understand where he was coming from a lot of the time, even if he processed such information poorly and I didn't quite empathize with him. I could see that he had some logic to his actions, even if it was very flawed, and the pleasant nature of most of the other cast around him really helped balance out how bitter he is, and keep the show from feeling super cynical or bitter. Now, it was painfully obvious to me from the start of the series that Frank never meant to hurt Maki, but no one said Takado was the most reasonable man. He doesn't feel like a cringe edgelord, and he doesn't feel like a nihilist doomer, though. If anything, he feels a tad unhinged, but not enough to completely derive him of the ability to reason or even empathize. He is figuratively and physically scarred, and that's probably the best way to describe him. He isn't likable per se most of the time, but it's obvious that he's damaged goods, so we cut him a little slack and do take some interest in the progression of his healing. A progression that, while painfully slow and clunky at times, is so by design, and does have some payoff when he actually does realize that, hey, maybe he's part of the problem. And I do respect that growth eventually occurring, because like in the real world, it's not always consistent. Frank, meanwhile, for 70% of the show is the exact opposite, where Takado comes off as someone who dwells too much and is antisocial and unlikable. Frank is a robot who only regains limited speech around episode 16, although it's obvious from the start that he is a team player and a benevolent being, although this is initially unclear if it's out of some kind of altruism or simple lack of higher thought. As the series progresses, though, his actions start to speak for themselves, and we begin to root for and see Frank as more than just a robot. We soon start to understand that he has some kind of conscience, and his actions even point to some kind of moral strength within him as well. Upon regaining higher thought as Yuri, Frank does have a moment of great pain where he realizes that he inadvertently killed his wife. But Takado's final realization of his own flaws remind Frank that there's hope, and that there's things he's got to do and he's got to get out of his slump as well. And that's amazing, because as a show about communication, Argento Soma stars two characters who, for some reason or other, suck at communicating, and then finally learn how to do it by communicating to each other. Takuto is emotionally walled off and very biased in most things. He lacks the emotional intelligence to effectively communicate and listen to with others, and this results in most of his personal relationships being rather unpleasant and impersonal. Meanwhile, Frank literally does not get speech back until the tail end of the series, and is thus physically limited in his ability to communicate with everyone except Harriet, who, due to the brain metal implant, kind of can understand him pretty well. And they both overcome their starting handicaps to talk to each other, and finally realize and express how grateful they are to everyone around them. They are both able to make peace with each other and themselves by talking to others. And that's beautiful. It was very bold to essentially put the theme so front and center of the series as to construct intentionally distant characters to emphasize it. But it works because both characters are still very memorable and well integrated into this overall idea of communication. It's obvious that they were crafted to support this theme, and they do it very well, even if it results in an execution that might seem as a bit heavy-handed at points. The series is not always the most subtle. But that's another thing I like about it. While there is praise for subtle and figurative language and writing, sometimes it's nice to just hear things bluntly and succinctly explained. And that is Argento Soma. It doesn't waste your time, doesn't get too conceptual with its themes, it just, almost point blankly at times, states ideas and shows you them. For example, although Maki is only alive in episode 1, the brief interactions she has with Takuto immediately display to us that Takuto kinda sucks at listening and conveying information well. To further drill that this is going to be a show about communication into our heads, the Professor Noguchi who led Morgue was literally the Professor of Cultural Contact, or something like that, who near verbatim tells people, and therefore the audience, to just talk to each other and try to communicate. Almost everything is near spelled out for us, but it doesn't really feel like the series is trying to hold our hands. It just feels like some of the characters in the show have enough pragmatism and emotional intelligence to understand these ideas and then just convey them to the audience via their interactions with other characters. It's by no means subtle, no. In fact, one might criticize the show for how blunt it can be, but I find that refreshing, that a show about the importance of communication clearly communicates this at times to the viewer, even if it's via two characters who cannot communicate well initially. This blunt construction also bleeds into the superficial and, depending on personal taste, tacky or cute edge of the series. As a whole, Argento Soma is actually very wholesome. It's full of good life advice, character growth, gratitude, and a big fluffy dog. Technically no one from the main cast dies, on screen at least, and I don't think a swear word is said it more than 2 or 3 times in the whole series. And yet the series contains surface elements that attempt to paint it as the exact opposite. There are elements of the series that try to make Argento Soma seem like the most epic, hardcore, badasses only gauntlet that only the truly cool and apathetic among us will understand. And I think that's hilarious. I find it very ironically funny that the same series with Walton the dog also wants to convince us at times that it's the edgiest thing since the invention of razor blades. Whether it's Ryu's over-the-top redesign, the constant mention and occasional use of nuclear warheads, or even the naming conventions of episodes, they tried way too hard to make the series seem way more hardcore than it really is. And the naming conventions themselves deserve a note in and of themselves. Every episode title consists of X and Y. And I swear multiple episode titles include the word hate, chaos, despair, or something of the like. For example, an episode would be like chaos and truth, or hate and despair. And even if all of this makes remembering episode titles seem kind of difficult for how vague and vaguely applicable they are, I'm okay with that because it's hilarious. Questionable naming conventions even extend to in-universe things. For example, the over-the-top use of morbid codenames like Morgue, Funeral, and Tod, mispronounced as Todd here, could be seen as pretty cringe, but it's also kind of humorous to me because it's so over the top. It's like they wanted to add a layer of edge to appeal to the times that this was coming out in, without actually sacrificing or interfering with the pretty wholesome tone of the show. It's like they kind of tacked these things on just to fit with the 2000s, and not really because they wanted to, and it doesn't actually interfere with the surprisingly good handling of the psychological nuances and arcs present. These nuances in turn form the nucleus of a series less about overcoming aliens and more about overcoming our inherent biases. I mean, the series is literally about people learning to accept the quote outsider and realize that the only thing they had to fear was their fear of that outsider. Every character has some sort of baggage, and while the show has a surface level of over-the-top edge, the actual psychological explorations are consistently handled in a respectful, interesting, and engaging manner. They do a great job of separating the shallow attempts at edge from the actual psychological introspectives so that the former does not diminish the latter. For example, while Takudo is kind of an archetypal brooding malcontent, and I commented on his redesign, his arc and actions are written in a way that still make him pretty accessible and logical to the viewer. We may not agree with them, but we can see that there is some kind of logic here driven by actual pain, and not just some quote cool guy apathy. He's not a saint, but he still shows enough moral fiber to act for the greater good, and we see enough of him to understand that his fractured psyche is a result of trauma, and not just because he wants to be cool or because the creative team wanted to make someone, quote, super cool. We get enough to understand that he's actually going through some things, and his mannerisms are not just about spectacle. We understand that regardless of any funny business around him, his pain is something to take serious, and the psychological journey he goes on is an actual serious attempt at some kind of psychological commentary. We understand he's in real pain, and the show never plays up the emotional pain of him or any other character just to do so, instead skillfully integrating everyone's past trauma into their characters and motivations, making that and overcoming them all the more impactful while distancing them from the kitsch attempts at cool. And this taps into Argento Soma's second defining theme of forgiving others and especially forgiving oneself. While the theme of communication is conveyed extremely bluntly, beyond that, Argento Soma also contains multiple small story arcs about forgiving oneself. I mean, this is one of the cores of Takudo's character, even if he doesn't initially realize it, and for a brief bit Frank's too. Where theme 1 is presented with the subtlety of a train horn, this theme is actually presented quite subtly, and it's done quite well. And we see it in multiple character arcs, whether it be for Takudo, Frank, Heartland, Iness, or a few others. And there is also a subtle linkage between this and the theme of communication, in that the past trauma of many is one of the things that gives them difficulty with communicating with others. You see, a natural response to trauma is building up a protective emotional wall around your heart in order to try and keep yourself safe from other pains. However, as that wall might be seen as a protective measure, it can also keep bad feelings inside, and it can also keep suspicions inside, meaning that it makes communicating with and bonding with others difficult at points. And we see this with a good majority of the cast. Ryu is the most prominent example, as his trauma makes him extremely walled off, and this causes a lot of difficulty for him throughout the entirety of the series. However, we see this with other characters too, and that gets us back to the general idea of comes to terms with one's past pains. Iness starts to come to terms with the death of her daughter. Heartland starts to come to terms with the loss of his own unit. Dan starts to come to terms with the loss of his mother. Guinevere has, by this point, seemingly already come to terms with her impending fate. Sue comes to terms with the isolation she seems to feel. Ryu comes to terms with his own self-loathing and the fact that Frank isn't really the one to blame. Harriet comes to terms with her PTSD, and Frank comes to terms with the loss of his wife, and general fate. When I say come to terms with, I don't mean to say that these characters' pain is completely taken away, and that they've just completely gotten over these events that have haunted them. However, I do think it is an appropriate term to use, as it is correct to say that they have grown more accepting of the past, the fact that they cannot change it, and the fact that that shouldn't paint the entirety of their future. It's a neat little theme woven into every member of the cast that, while not the most vocal, is still important and does still help facilitate the communication at the core of the series. I appreciate this, as not only is this a second great theme that ties everything together, but it also shows that the creative team knew how to operate in more modes than just point-blank statement mode. In terms of narrative structure, while the characters were obviously crafted to fit the ideas, the actual timeline and pacing of the series is pretty linear and standard. It takes a few episodes to set everything up, simmers for a long stretch with Monster of the Week episodes in the middle, and then has a massive mound of twists near the end, and quickly runs to a frantic but overall satisfying conclusion, capped off with a nice Where Are They Now episode. It's probably the least avant-garde aspect of the narrative, but then again, not everything needs to be fancy or unorthodox, and the linear construction is in line with the often open nature of the messaging here. That's not to say that there's nothing out of the box though, as Argento Soma makes good use of flashback in random, but appropriate, moments. Oftentimes, someone will say something that brings up a painful memory for Ryu, who then disassociates into a past memory. And this allows three things. 1. Falling into Ryu's memories serves the basic task of displaying them to us and serving as exposition. 2. The random nature of Ryu's disassociation and his failures to realize when it's just a memory at points show us that he really is in some mental turmoil and not just playing up his nihilism for spectacle. And 3. The occurrence of flashbacks breaks up the conventional narrative structure enough to be interesting without derailing it. Importantly, it allows the show to make Ryu understandable without dedicating multiple full episodes to his backstory. And I specifically note this because Argento Soma falls into its main structure fast. I mean, Ryu's origins and Maki's death are almost completely covered in episode 1, and from there the Monster of the Week stuff starts soon afterwards. As such, we never really get to know Ryu pre-accident, and the use of flashbacks is a near necessity that bridges this gap and ensures that this lack of setup does not cripple the series. I do applaud the series for not really setting up its main character and somehow making this work. Argento Soma is also a series that loves its twists, and while the use of them doesn't break the conventional structure, their impacts and how they reflect on previous setups to some extent warp it. For example, Argento Soma takes its time setting up the idea that the aliens cannot be allowed the pilgrimage point at any cost. It does an intentionally bad job explaining what the red or yellow zones are, or showing us that the aliens are actually bad, but the cast sticks to these ideas. The show tells us the surface layers of these things without really expanding on them and simply letting inertia carry us through, even though the aliens don't really seem evil, just ignorant of the harm they inflict. Even though a lot of this destruction here is man-made. As a result, things kind of seem off from the very start, or at least when we start to pick up on this, and sets up the twists that come later in the series very well. The show sets up the assumption of vague danger, lets it stew, and then lets it fall flat on its face to mock the inability of humanity to communicate openly and respectfully at times, to accept the outsider at times, and to further reinforce its ideas about the importance of communication. Even the most questionable twist, that of the aliens not actually being aliens, works surprisingly well because it is in line with the ideas that the show predicates itself on. It's thematically fitting too that this twist is only revealed once the team actually starts to view Frank as a member of it, that they actually start to see the humanity within him, only to learn that he's been human the whole time. I love this integration of plot twists in the core ideas, and respect the bold decision to essentially scrap the surface premise of the whole show as it nears its conclusion to further said integration. From a logical standpoint, I also want to say that Argento Soma does a pretty good job setting up its twist-relevant characters and events pretty early on. Whether it's the Ulysses popping up a few times, or Frank having some kind of higher intelligence, enough is put in the early episodes to set up the twists so that they feel sudden, but sensical. I mean, Yuri shows up in episode 1 if we count the credits, and although I was confused by what I assumed to be stock image astronaut guy for the first 16 episodes, when the twist hit, I was like, oh, that was Frank! That was Frank! I know who that is! Planning clearly went into this. Finally, for a few miscellaneous notes before we get into the technicals and other stuff, I love how this is kind of an inverse of the Frankenstein novel alluded to throughout the series. While this series is not really based on that book, it took some ideas from it. I mean, the character Frank is kind of an homage to it. He's literally called Frank after Frankenstein, after all. And that's not happenstance, he was literally named that by the team at Morgue, because they assembled him from the components of various aliens given life. It's an intended reference. Like in the 1818 book, Frank is initially misunderstood and feared. He's seen as a brute, and his intelligence and benevolence are greatly overlooked or ignored. Some see him as pitiful, some see him as fearsome, but no one really likes him or sees him as human. Also, like in the book, Frank's creator, Takuto, kind of, sort of, I mean, he didn't make him, but he did help revive him, hates Frank for reasons more pertaining to personal demons than actual justified ones. Unlike the book, though, which takes a series of more and more tragic turns based upon miscommunication and ignorance, here Frank is given chances to actually prove himself. And when he does, people warm up to him, and he in return saves them. The book is about people letting their biases and fears take over, unrightfully condemning a tragic creature created by an arcane experiment, where here, the people start to slowly trust and even value that creature. In the book, creator and creature never overcome their hate of each other, and this gets both of them killed. Here though, creator and creature do overcome that hate and it ends up saving both of them. This series is like an anti-Frankenstein, and I love how this structure both pays homage to something that the creative team thought was cool, but also takes it in some very new, borderline opposite directions. It means that I can see the through lines from this inspirational material, but I can also see how they greatly changed it, and how they wanted to put their own spin on it to tell the anti-version of it. A story which I really like. I also want to say that this series was directed by Kazuyoshi Katayama, and while that name might be familiar, I want you to know that that's the guy who directed The Big O. Now, if you know anything about this channel, that series gets mentioned way too much on this channel, and I love it more than many other people. But perhaps that's why one of the reasons the series feels so comfortingly similar to me, because like The Big O, it has a lot of its weird twists and ideas that don't seem like they should fit well together, but do. Finally, that leaves us with a curious note on episode 24.5, the OVA. Now, I think the only reason that this is an OVA is because it was made post the final episode, as on a technical level, it looks the same as every other episode, and it was made by the same studio too. I think what happened was the production team either had enough cut material to craft an episode together post-mortem, brought a cut episode back to life, or simply got bored, and this little Easter egg was the result. Now, this bonus episode takes place around Takedo joining the team, but before he goes on missions with them, so it's pretty early on, and it centers on Sue and her past. Long story short, Sue had a rough time of things early in her life, and this is a sort of psychological exploration of that, using the framing of escaping a crevasse in Antarctica. Now, the episode is weird. It's definitely not standalone, and tonally it doesn't really fit too well either, as Sue's backstory is very intense, and handled in a way that doesn't feel like other intense backstories in the series are. It feels more brooding and dark than many others. In addition, her portrayal also feels different than what we see in the show. Instead of the good-natured and fun, and even perceptive and sensitive young woman we see a lot of in the series, here she's kind of distant, she's brooding, and she's borderline antisocial. Now, I understand that's the result of the trauma also revealed in this episode, but how they handle it and just her characterization as a whole don't feel in line with the rest of the series. And this makes me think that this was a cut episode made before the writers really knew what direction they wanted to take the character in. Like, they had it, and maybe they thought it didn't fit too well, so they cut it, but then they released it later just so people could have it. I don't know how canon it is, but even if I don't think it fits well with the rest of the series, I personally choose it to be canon because it means this frame in the final episode is just a miscolor, and that this frame is the correct one. And I just like certain Sue designs more as a man of culture. On the topic of designs, we finally get to the technical component of this retrospective. Now, objectively speaking, the technicals are probably the weakest part of the series, as it's clear that it didn't have the biggest budget, but I consider that part of the charm. Now, Argento Soma looks older than it actually is, as it's a sort of the last hurrah for hand-drawn animation, as digital stuff started to become the norm with the arrival of the 2000s, and this series was actually aired in the 2000s, 2000 to 2001. Although just by looking at it, you could be forgiven for thinking it aired any year in the 90s. As a result of the hand-drawn animation, Argento Soma boasts some of the consistency the style is known for. Look at anything hand-drawn, anything, and you will see that due to the complex method of production, sometimes consistency simply isn't 100%. From Batman the Animated Series to The Big O and the Many Faces of Alex Rosewater, that's just the nature of the beast. And Argento Soma is no exception to this. Some of the frames are gorgeous and polished and beautiful. A few look rather questionable, especially when it comes to facial details, and the vast majority are great and get the job done pretty well. I will say that overall the quality is quite high. It's definitely higher than The Big O, and I only state this because I find that series' questionable quality control very funny, and to say that in spite of the odd frames here and there, Argento Soma is still a beautiful piece. There's a lot of great moving action shots, some great work with framing, and just something for everyone, whether it be nice establishing shots, emotional close-ups, or some fluid action. There is something that simply cannot be replicated about hand-drawn stuff, and it always draws me in. It's just more visceral than the digital stuff that came shortly after it, and while I like the soft digital look that succeeded this, it's just not the same. Perhaps because of all the inconsistency, we can see all of the effort and human elements that went into bringing a series like this to life, and I appreciate that. It's the little quirks that remind us that we're all human, and to simply enjoy the story presented here. For this reason, I don't really like nitpicking quality control on stuff like this, because we have to remember how much of a task it must have been simply to get it done in the first place. That being said, if I did have to nitpick one technical aspect of the series, I gotta ask, what's wrong with your face? While the occasional awkward zoom or still is funny, just look at the channel icon, Argento Soma's animators seem to have somewhat consistent problems with noses at certain angles for some reason. Now, I know anime as a medium doesn't have the most realistic portrayal of noses in a lot of shots, especially depending on the art style, but this is beyond a technical one-off flub. It's like someone didn't quite know how to draw the nose in shots like this, and so they just didn't. I don't hate it, but I could see someone hating it, and if there was one thing we could all objectively criticize, it would probably be this. It's just kind of weird. The designs themselves, though, are pretty good. I like how realistic everything feels. No one here is super jacked, and no one here is super unrealistically portioned. As these are all people in their 30s and 40s, they all look like people in their 30s and 40s. And the designs of other things adjacent to the characters also feels realistic and grounded, whether it be the flight suits or even the mechs themselves, which, although kind of weird, are still vaguely humanoid for reasons revealed in this show. Nothing here is too fanciful. It is advanced enough to let us know that this is a science fiction future, but not distracting enough to subtract from the grounded nature of the series as a whole. Even the aliens themselves are pretty humanoid, and while making whale sounds, do have pretty conventional designs in most aspects. The only thing about design that I don't really like are the fact that Frank's mask that he gets halfway through the series changes his facial appearance. I just prefer the original design without the mask, but you know, that's a nitpick on a preference that isn't really objective, that's just how I feel about it. What stood out to me the most is that there is a good amount of camera work focusing on Ryu's face, often showing solely one side of him. And this selective display of different sides of Ryu, depending on how we're supposed to feel about him in this scene, do a good job not only showing the dual nature of the character, but getting us to feel something about him. They show the scary face when he's mad or upset and we know he's being a scumbag, and they show the normal, softer face when we're supposed to sympathize with him and understand that he is a man driven by insecurity and pain. While this camera work alone wasn't really enough to get me fully behind the character, it was a good use of camera work and a unique character design. It's something that deserves credit for that alone. Talking about perspective, though, I will say that perspective and scale is sometimes an issue with Argento Soma, as a lot of things don't necessarily seem too consistent. Sometimes Frank seems really tall, sometimes he doesn't seem as tall. The most pressing example of issues with scale and perspective, though, come whenever we get shots of the Mistel, the mothership. Sometimes when we get shots from within the cockpit, it looks a lot bigger, because we see that everyone has their kind of like working console, they have all these buttons and knobs, and there is a good amount of space between each console. But then we get flat shots like this, where we see the cockpit head on, and it just looks so much more cramped. I'm going to chalk this up to the inconsistencies of hand-drawn animation, and the fact that some frames are simply reused to save time, but it is something that I noticed, and does kind of break your immersion every now and again. Overall, the designs and looks of everything is great. Now getting to the audio, Argento Soma punches above its weight, boasting both a great dub and original soundtrack. I love the entirety of the original soundtrack and its use throughout the series. The original soundtrack for Argento Soma is on the smaller side, and probably one of the more obvious signs of a limited budget. Now there are a few grand and sweeping pieces like The Astronauts, but beyond this, the general small scale of the songs and the soundtrack as a whole, in fact a sizable chunk of it are just different versions of the same song, hint at production limitations. I don't want to say issues because everything here is pretty good and pretty clean, but the fact that there isn't that much do speak of a limited scale here. In spite of this, the OST is in general very well used and just varied enough to get away with the small scale of everything present. You do hear the same songs a lot, and you do even hear them looped a few times, but there is enough variety here where that's not really an issue. I also very much like the accordion motifs present, and I will say that in spite of its small size, the OST still has a sound all of its own. Just please note that I will use other OSTs here because this is a long video and I don't want you to get sick of otherwise good songs. I also love how the original soundtrack is integrated in universe, seeing how Frank's recognition of Harriet's song, a song his wife used to sing, is what makes him trust her in the first place, setting up the importance of that song both in and out of universe. Now, I have mentioned on the channel before that I am a heretic who tends to prefer dubbed anime to subbed anime because I'm a lazy American who can't read, and I think Argento Soma is a point in favor of this argument. The dub one, not the reading one. While the only voice actor names and voices that I clearly recognized instantly were Bo Billingsley as Heartland, Crispin Freeman as Dan, Michael McConaughey and Jameson Price in bit roles, and Michelle Ruff in a few bit parts in the end of episode teasers, everyone here does amazing work. I don't know why, but everyone here just sounds extremely natural, like I'm just a fly on the wall of their everyday lives. It's like they're not even performing, it's like they are the characters and they're in the room with me. Steve Staley, Toshiro Hitsugaya, does a great job sounding upset and brooding as Takado. He doesn't sound like he's trying to be upset, but actually is. In addition, his vocal range does a great job voicing many of the manic moments that the character has, and really making it seem like we're watching a man slowly losing his sanity. I always love looking for the one, quote, main character role in a VA's work list, and if this is Staley's only one, he did great. Besides him is Lex Lang as Frank. Now this is a very weird performance to judge, considering that Frank doesn't really talk until remembering he's Yuri. Although when this happens, Lang flips a switch to sound like a completely different VA. When Frank is pre-Yuri discovery, he has a really low, grumbly, mumbly, stereotypical Frankenstein-like voice. Then when he remembers that he's Yuri and regains all of his memories, he has a very professional voice. I find this impressive, and since Lang does successfully commit to voicing a character without a literal voice for most of the series, and then voicing said character with a very different voice, I think some credit is due here. Next we get to Sandy Fox as Harriet. Fox shows a good emotional range here, as she voices a child often overwhelmed by her own emotions and the situations around her causing them. But above that, she also gives Harriet a lot of the simple energy her scenes need to be believable. She sounds like a child actively in the midst of a very exciting and at times distressing world. For an energy reference, note that this is the same woman who dubbed the Tachikomas of Ghost in the Shell. Once again, it's just a performance that seems very natural and in line with the character. In line with natural performances are the entirety of the funeral unit. Bo Billingsley's earthy tones give Heartland the warm, authoritative voice befitting a professional but very kind leader. Crispin Freeman does a great job giving Dan Simmons his pompous and very British flair. Paula Walker gives Guinevere her serene air, and Laura Jill Miller does kind of the opposite with Sue Harris, infusing her character with a playful, cooperative, and surprisingly perceptive personality. Finally, Melody Spivak makes Iness sound stern, and yet reasonably compassionate. All of these voice actors sound exactly like I imagine their characters should, and are a testament to how well everything simply fits here. They did a great job casting every single main and secondary character, and the performances by said voice actors and actresses are also great. And then they even got some great voices for the bit roles. As mentioned earlier, Michelle Ruff appears in every episode to do the teaser, and I recognized her immediately, especially since a lot of the teaser's pseudo-poems sound like something I could see Ruki Akuchiki saying. Next up, we gotta do the obligatory Michael McConaughey shout-out. Look, you guys know I love this guy's voice, and here it's instantly recognizable and great. Unofficial main character of the channel, great voice. And then finally, that gets us to Jameson Price as Kilgore. Now, Kilgore is just some kind of lazy last-minute throwaway roadblock character, but I recognized that voice instantly. But a name wasn't forthcoming, but I knew I heard it somewhere. And then I thought, that's Big Ear of Big O fame! And I was right. Price is like McConaughey, where these guys don't really show up all the time, but their deep voices are instantly recognizable and smooth. And I also want to say sorry to Mr. Price for not mentioning his performance as the Count of Monte Cristo in the Genkatsu retrospective, because while that show might actually be better subbed, Price is great in it as the main character. Speaking of characters, that gets us to our first character section, that on Michael Heartland. I want to start with Heartland because I think in some ways he kind of embodies the series. They're both plain-spoken and honorable, that while containing or alluding to dark elements, maintain a surprisingly wholesome and upright course throughout the series that can teach us a few things about simply forgiving ourselves and moving forward. In Heartland's case specifically, he's a man defined by his loss, but where that is often the start of a tragic arc, for Heartland it is only part of a heroic one, as he endeavors to never let that thing happen again, and to put the safety of his team second to only the safety of the world as a whole. He's a reliable and likable guy, and serves as a backstop for the team, and a voice of morality for Commander Iness. Heartland is also a great example of positive masculinity, guiding his team with a protective and assertive, yet fair and caring hand, willing to take a stand for what is right, even if his orders contradict this. This is a very subtle but serious service that Heartland does to the series as a whole, balancing out the insecurities of Takedo and to some extent Dan, and letting us see that there is some good in humanity at least, and at least some of the cast is and will be likable from the start. When we first meet Heartland pretty early on in the series, he leads the funeral team to a reported alien sighting in northern Montana. This is his first encounter with Frank, and it sets him up on a collision course with both him and Harriet and Ryu. As the team's field commander, he's initially skeptical of using Harriet to control Frank against the aliens, but follows orders to do so. As he leads the team on their Monster of the Week escapades, we learn that Heartland values his team so much because he lived through the pain of seeing his old one wiped out before his eyes. And he soon starts to view Harriet and Frank as extensions of that team, and refuses multiple orders to detonate the bomb on Frank's neck, out of respect for Harriet, and later out of respect for Frank himself. As things do get more desperate though, in one particular case, he does agree to use it only to find it's a fake. By the time the big twists near episode 17 arrive, Heartland has already fully bought into Frank being one of his guys though, and soon confirms it as he airlifts Frank away from the bombing at Pilgrimage Point. He then helps Funeral resist the military takeover of their base. When this is successful, he is one of the many who sees Frank off, and later leads the mission to communicate with Giga Frank in the final episode 6 years later. While Heartland does not have the most extreme arc, I think that's one of the reasons it works so well. In line with Argento Soma having a literally more mature cast than many other anime, Heartland feels like a guy who's already completed a big chunk of his character arc. He feels mature and developed, although still capable of learning and growing, of course. He's already had his trauma and reflected on it, and this allows him to take point as a steady leader who values his team very much. That's not to say that there is no arc though, as like the rest of the team, he slowly learns to accept Frank and Harriet. His status as the leader of the team though adds another dimension to this. Heartland's relationship with Frank is a subtle but well-executed little bond that reflects not only on his evolving views of the robot, but also his priorities as a leader and a man. This is because as the field commander, he literally has Frank's life in his hands due to him possessing one of 2 keys needed to detonate the bomb on Frank's neck. Although there are many potential chances to use this bomb, which later proves to be a fake, Heartland only actually agrees to use it once, going so far as to refuse direct orders to do so on other occasions. While this may be seen as irresponsible, seeing how Heartland constantly stalls at times for his team to create non-nuclear options, it also reflects on the great faith he has in his team, and later Frank himself, as well as how much he values them as a whole. In fact, the only reason he agreed to use the key that one time was because he thought the whole team would die otherwise, and objectively speaking, 80% of a team is better than 0. Heartland's stubborn actions, though, reflect on his personal mission of safeguarding his team. Even if he claims sparing Frank is just for tactical reasons, it's obvious that he soon starts to view Frank as an extension of that team, who he needs to protect as well. This personal mission is born from the past trauma of watching a unit under his command being wiped out. While we never see this, we do hear of it, and it adds an understandable motivation to Heartland's decision-making, as he vows to make right what he sees as a personal failure by giving his team as many options as possible to avoid a repeat of that failure, even if the team has to make those options themselves. While he does take his job seriously and accepts that sacrifices ultimately are necessary at times, he is fluid enough in his thinking and strong enough in his nerves to try and find new solutions if they guarantee higher survival rates, patiently exhausting all other options before going in guns blazing or full nuclear. In spite of Heartland being a veteran who has seen some horrible things, he does come to respect Frank surprisingly quickly, initially because he's a useful weapon, but then also because he's a loyal ally. I think this open mind, and indeed his open heart, are why Heartland is a great leader. He isn't great because he's the smartest guy in the room, or because he's the most dangerous, but because he genuinely values his team, listens to their ideas, and then just kind of manages the situation as needed. He isn't the most hands-on, but this is a credit to his faith in his team and understanding the dangers of micromanagement. He of course steps in when he has to, and is even willing to make sacrifices if he needs to, but is generally content to let this team do their job how they see fit. He doesn't always need to be right, he doesn't always need to have complete control, and he doesn't always need or expect everything to go according to plan. Instead, his humble dedication manifests itself in a self-assured security that helps him trust and support his team, instead of dictating to them and lording over them. In fact, although he is a respected leader, He doesn't take his title that seriously and is generally pretty casual with his team, and seemingly pretty close to all of them except Ryu, who, to be fair, is close to no one. He's just a really good boss. But Heartland is more than just a unit commander, even if a great one, as he's also the rock of the team. He has emotions, but other than maybe Guinevere, tends to be the most calm of the field unit, and is almost always maintaining a level, logical head. He knows how to manage personalities and keep people from reckless behavior, and understands the need to step back at times. He knows to stay professional, all the while allowing himself to empathize with others, improving both his moral judgment and his ability to help others see his points. More importantly though, he's also a backstop for Commander Iness and sort of her conscience. While the latter is somewhat cold and calculating when we first meet her, Heartland's honest emotional appeals genuinely help warm her up and genuinely help her see the value in empathizing with her subordinates and supporting their own ideas as well. While Iness is exposed to the politicking and corrupt agendas of the higher-ups, Heartland is not, and consistently reminds her of her obligation to the team and their top priority of saving lives. When Iness starts to become too cold and calculating at points, Heartland calls her out for that. When she starts to bend the rules for the greater good, he encourages this. As a result, Heartland's principles shape not only those under him, but also those above him and how they conduct themselves and the organization as a whole. This is not just because he's a good leader, but also because he's a good man. Next up, we have the character of Dan Simmons, the previous ace pilot of the Funeral Task Force, at least before Ryu's arrival, and his sort of rival for most of the series. Now, Dan is a great example of a nuanced rival, as while he initially seems to be rather insufferable at times, these behaviors are all born out of detailed personal tragedies that provide a logical, if logically flawed, base for his seemingly illogical actions and behaviors. You're not always going to like Dan, but by the end of the series, I feel that there's a good chance you may understand and perhaps even respect him. He can be a bit of a bully at times, but he is dedicated to the team and eventually outgrows his misbehaviors. We first meet Dan along with the rest of the Zard unit as they head to Montana. In this initial confrontation, Dan distinguishes himself immediately as a man of great confidence in his skill, and he seems to take great pride in being the so-called best pilot of the group. That is until Ryu joins the group and a fierce rivalry begins. This takes the form of many things, whether it's Dan trolling Ryu in training simulations, his dismissal of Ryu's ideas and skills, his intense suspicion of Ryu, which is ironically proven correct, and even outright fighting. Eventually, the latter results in the two spending a night together in the brig, under Heartland's orders, in order to try and force an understanding, which does kind of work. In this episode, we also learn about Dan's past, and why a seemingly wealthy, made-for-life Nepo baby would choose such dangerous work, and how it drives him and his insecurities. Dan does all of these things and is the man he is today for two main reasons. In a broader view, Dan simply does want to do the right thing and help protect people. But on a much more personal level, Dan also does what he does because he wants to be in constant motion. His father was some kind of high official somewhere whose demeanor may or may not have contributed to his wife's self-termination. That is Dan's mother. And now reduced to a mute of sorts with no connection to others or the outside world, Dan's father now just kind of mopes around making model ships all day. He's essentially led himself off of a cliff because he always thought he was right or had to be right, and then couldn't deal with the consequences of holding himself so highly. Dan thus seeks challenges to help avoid this, as he loathes the pit his father has allowed himself to sink into. Anyways, post-lockup, Dan and Ryu are still rivals, but somewhat functional now, and continue to work together on the Monster of the Week episodes. He also goes on this brief side quest with Sue, which I mentioned because that's the first time they really do stuff together, and may or may not have been intended to set up their marriage. Anyways, after all of the big plot twist, we get one more, obviously fake one, when Dan, quote, helps the military take over the funeral base. Now, this betrayal is a very short-lived ruse, and he uses his authority and knowledge of the base to help Ryu and Harriet sneak in to talk to Frank. He is then one of the many to say farewell to Frank, and we see him 6 years later, where he's still with Funeral acting as a top pilot, just now married to the unit's new commander, Sue. While I'm not too attached to Dan's character, I do really like what the series did with it, crafting a rival that at times is both sufficiently unlikable, and yet also somewhat understandable. If Ryu and Frank's relationships are near the core of the series, then Dan and Ryu's is a neat little facsimile of that. Ryu hates Frank, who doesn't really notice, and Dan hates Ryu, who doesn't really care. Eventually all three parties grow to respect each other though, and this helps save the day. Now this rival initiated by Dan also serves as our window to his character, for better and worse. When we first meet Dan, he seems very cool and collected, maybe a little arrogant or headstrong, but otherwise quite professional and controlled. As soon as Ryu enters the picture though, Dan sort of flips a switch. He starts to become noticeably more petty, more aggressive, and less professional. He in fact becomes somewhat consumed by trying to put Ryu in his place. And on a surface level, this flip is because of the basic envy he has of Ryu's skills and suspicions of his motivations, seemingly unjustified but understandable things. We soon learn though that while his distrust of Ryu is near the core of his character, it's not the actual core, as that instead is his own insecurities and how he confronts these. All of Dan's early interactions with Ryu hint at a deep insecurity, a fear of not being good enough, of not taking enough action, of not moving enough, of not staying in motion, and of just stagnating and withering away. And all of this stems from his personal life. As the scion of a rich noble family, Dan Simmons is essentially made for life, but he realizes that material comfort is not all there is. Instead, he chooses military life as an active refusal of a comfortable life, because he fears that that and complete power or complete control will lead to stagnation and death, something he resents his father for. Dan seems to hate that man not only because it's implied he drove his wife to death, but also because of how he handles the consequences of that. When Dan watches his dad build model ships all day, he sees a man who's completely stagnated and given up because he destroyed the one thing that offered pushback, his wife. And instead of admitting this or owning up to his mistakes, his father just kind of shuts down, and Dan hates him even more for that. He hates that someone could do something so awful and then just live in self-pity. Dan doesn't fear being second best because of some kind of self-esteem issue, but because he fears that he might simply freeze over like his father if he doesn't always try to excel. And this is why he has to show off. It's why he has to be the best, and why he can't stand Ryu, quote, horning in on his role. He lashes out because he fears if Ryu is the number one guy, then there's nothing really left for him, and that he's going to end up like his father, which is kind of ironic seeing how that he hates his father for always having to have been right, and yet here he kind of always has to get his way too. And it's also ironic seeing how rivalries often force both sides to try harder, but the point stands. This deep fear is also why Dan's motivations are surprisingly complex, as it's hard to draw the line between selfless and selfish motivations with the guy. On one hand, he does genuinely seem to want to do the right thing because it is the right thing. He has a sister that he cares about, and he would hate to see anyone else's family hurt in the invasion. On the other hand, it's no doubt that he sees the struggles tied to his work as an end in it of themselves, of proof that he's actually doing something and not like his father. He wants to fight simply for self-validation because it is an action and therefore proves that he's taking actions. And we could see that him fighting for this kind of validation is arguably a little selfish and tied more to personal quests than a moral stand. And this then gets us to talking about post-lockup Dan. Once he starts to reflect on things and respect Ryu, Dan does slowly work his way out of his toxic behaviors. Post-lockup, he still has snide moments with Ryu, but also genuinely starts to respect his abilities and understand that he is his teammate. He no longer hates the man, and seems to appreciate that the latter doesn't really judge his family trauma. As such, Dan starts to slowly outgrow his more hostile behaviors as he realizes that Ryu isn't the threat he thought him to be, which is ironic considering Ryu actually was the spy he suspected him to be, and that he has his own issues to work on. Anyways, Dan's forced reflection gives him time to think about why he fights, selfless and selfish. He remembers that while fighting for Funeral may give him personal validation, that validation shouldn't come from just fighting itself, but also what he fights to protect. While this may be a little selfish, it is a lot less selfish than simply fighting to fight, and Dan comes to accept that he's not the be-all end-all, and not being so will not instantly make him end up like his father. He starts to relax, and eventually this even ends up with him marrying a woman his exact opposite, Sue. Dan is a great rival not because he's always likable, but because of his arc of overcoming his toxic behaviors and working with someone he doesn't like via self-reflection. He's a good rival because he pushes Ryu, but also pushes himself to become better men. And I guess that gets us to talking about Sue Harris. Look, I love this character. Now, Sue is the least active of the pilots, but probably my favorite character of the entire series, and she's great not just because of her design, but also because of her relaxed and comforting personality, balanced out by a very high degree of emotional intelligence and understanding. While she might just initially seem like the team airhead, Sue consistently proves herself to be rather intelligent and capable of perception, seeing the emotional needs and yearnings of many around her before they themselves even do. And in addition to that, she's not a pushover, even if a team player, and her quiet confidence and strong moral backbone make her instantly likable and essential for seeing to moral concerns early on in the series. This, plus her relatively friendly and cooperative demeanor, make her an excellent addition to the series, helping balance out less likable characters like Ryu or even Dan at times. And overall, hers is a very subtle but important part of Argento Soma. Like the rest of the Zarg unit, we first meet Sue when she encounters Frank in Montana. Unlike Dan and Guinevere though, Sue is often assigned to the role of piloting the mothership and is not always on the front lines in the first half of the series. Anyways, she assists the team in various roles until the capture of Frank and Harriet, when she is assigned the specific role of watching over Harriet because, quote, she is the most childlike of the Zarg unit. In other words, Sue gets put in charge of Harriet because it's thought she'll have the easiest time communicating and relating to her. And this is true, as Sue is the first character to actually show concern for Harriet and see how her PTSD is an issue that needs to be cared for and not just an annoying roadblock to exploiting Frank. And Sue starts to speak on Harriet's behalf and bond with her as the series progresses, spending time with her, listening to her concerns, and even voicing those concerns to those adults around her. Eventually, she and other factors convince the team of her points and to treat Harriet more humanely. As the series moves along, Sue also starts to pilot the actual Zargs in combat more, and even goes on that side quest with Dan we mentioned a few minutes ago. Cutting to the conclusion of the series, Sue is present for all of the big reveals, and then helps defeat the army takeover of the funeral base. She says goodbye to Frank, and then 6 years later, is revealed to have assumed control of the base and funeral, and to have married Dan. Now, quick note on the character dissection here. I don't know how canon the OVA episode is, so I'm not really going to consider it for the following section, although I'm sure there's some mental gymnastics you could use to make everything kind of work. Sue kind of saves the series as soon as she shows up, or at least gets the ball rolling on its characters becoming more human. And she saves the series not just because of her design, but because of her emotional intelligence and how she speaks on it. While Argento Soma is a pretty wholesome series, especially compared to how it markets itself, before Sue's arrival, the series does have a noticeable dearth of characters capable of basic communication and understanding, and this does start to get a little stifling by the first 4 or 5 episodes in the series. We have Ryu, a man clearly consumed by misguided hate and is never really too likable. Frank, a robot who can't talk. Harriet, the scared child, and a bunch of other people who, while professional, come off as a little too professional at times. All of this is not enough to turn someone away from the series, but just to say that it gets off to something of a slow start, and it is an incredibly fresh breath of air when Sue starts saying obvious things like, hey, maybe we should treat this child like a person, or hey, Harriet has feelings too. I felt like I, a member of the audience, had someone finally telling the cast exactly what I was thinking. And Sue instantly makes an initially cold cast much more warm and pretty human pretty quickly by doing all of these things. Seeing someone so relatable say what she does, and seeing the cast actually start to listen to this, gives the viewer hope for character development. She's extremely important as the first adult to actually try to understand and empathize with Harriet, and appreciate the complexities of trauma influencing and impairing her judgment early on. Just as importantly, Sue actually expresses her viewpoints rather clearly and objectively. She has a strong moral backbone and is not afraid to try and get her point across. She's no pushover and possesses an independent streak that pushes her to be heard. For example, it's one thing for Sue to just think about how the team could treat Harriet better, but it's another thing for her to go up to her boss and then clearly explain this. While she would never consider insubordination or jeopardizing others to prove a point, she will try to communicate one to a logical extent and level. She doesn't try to smuggle Harriet out or anything, but she does help her by just spending time with her and listening to her concerns and then voicing those to those above her. constantly telling Command that you need to treat this child like an actual child. This combination of perception and action are why Sue kind of saves the series early on, as while there was a potential for Funeral to coldly exploit the bond Harriet and Frank have in as efficient and scientific a manner as possible, Sue's constant objections and advocacy prevent this, instead directing her peers to be able to perceive what she does, the needs that Harriet has as a child. And this perception reflects on a sentimentality that most of the rest of the cast simply lacks. While Sue is held to be immature at times, I don't really think it's fair to dismiss her expression of emotion as such. Yeah, she tends to be less serious than most of her peers, but she still takes her job seriously and isn't even the most emotional one on the team, being much less so than both Ryu and Dan. She clearly knows what she's doing, and she also clearly knows that getting super emotional about something, or her place in the grand scheme of things, just isn't that helpful. Just because she tries to maintain a positive attitude doesn't mean she doesn't understand the importance of her work or self-control. And in fact, I would argue it helps the team out and the show as a whole out quite a bit by balancing out some of the more emotional characters here with a simple positivity. In line with this and the topic of her independent streak, Sue kind of just does her own thing for a lot of the series, being distinguished by her differing responsibilities, and there is a small arc about her slowly becoming closer with the other pilots in the unit. As the series progresses, she pilots the mothership less, and the actual Zargs more. Her conversations with others increase, and people start to see her as more than just the quirky third pilot. Regardless of whatever duty she executes though, Sue sees to it that that is executed well, and sees the quality of execution of anything as something important. She doesn't come off as someone driven by insecurity or selfish desires like some of the other team do at points, but simply as someone who's locked into their task at hand and takes a simple satisfaction in it. She never makes a real fuss and simply just gets the job done, reflecting on a quiet maturity that isn't really vocalized but is obvious to the viewer. Put simply, she's just happy to be here and operates on her own plane of sorts, but does so very well, and it's nice seeing her team slowly start to appreciate this and start to visit her there more and more. And in a medium where one great character design and a few moments can cement a series in the collective unconscious of many, I don't understand how Argento Soma isn't more remembered for Sue alone. I mean, her emotional intelligence and compassion are extremely refreshing, especially for the point in the series in which they arrive, and help set it on a brighter path pretty early on. These and her quirky personality distinguish her immediately, and it's a shame that she as a character is so obscure. That gets us to the final pilot of the Zarg unit, Guinevere Green. Now, Green is probably the weirdest of the cast to me in terms of handling, but I think that the execution, or at least the artistic vision here, is extremely good. And that's because Gwen serves as a living memento mori, a living embodiment of impending death. More on that later. And yet, where Argento Soma could have used this to crank up the superficial edge to 11, it never even tries this, instead handling this idea in an extremely gracious and dignified manner. Gwen's illness is never used to lament on death, but instead celebrate doing what one can before it arrives. This, plus the obtuse way the context of her illness is handled, give Gwen a surprising amount of depth for a character we don't really get to know that well, or even see too much of. Like everyone else so far, we first meet Gwen in Montana with the rest of the Zarg team. Within the team, she serves as a kind of second pilot and simply enjoys flying. Early on, she doesn't do too much than this and trade lines with Dan. Once Ryu joins the team though, she starts to serve as an important mediator between him and Dan, and the compassion she shows to Ryu even eventually helps him realize that his teammates are good people. This eventually results in him actually attempting to save Gwen from certain death, something that he fails at and Frank ultimately has to do, and they do have a little conversation during her recovery in the hospital. During said recovery and related flashbacks, we learn the reason Gwen is so calm is because she contracted a terminal illness space as a child, and so considers any day past that day, any day she's alive at this point, as a gift simply to be cherished. We also learn that her uncle, Mr. X/David Lawrence, is the one who got her in the funeral upon seeing her incredible mental strength. Anyways, she helps defend the base against the army, and then is among those who says goodbye to Frank when he departs. In the final episode, we learn that she has succumbed to her illness, but is buried in a sunny plot of land, so she can always appreciate the beauty of the sky she so loved. Now, death is the center of Gwen's character, not because she's a killer, or someone close to her was killed, but because she is, more than anyone else, acutely aware of her own mortality. As the victim of a terminal disease, Gwen knows that her time is limited, and therefore seeks to utilize it as best as possible. This is how she comes to embody the idea of Memento Mori. Now, that Latin phrase literally means remember to die, but instead of depressing an audience, it's meant to remind them to prioritize what's truly important in life, to appreciate the time that you do have, and do what needs to be done. And just as this seemingly morbid phrase is meant to be one of comforting reflection, Guinevere's character is as well, and this is why she's a near-perfect embodiment of the concept, and how it clearly shapes all of her actions gives her a serene air we don't see with any other character in the series. Now, I did have some debate within myself about whether Guinevere is simply resigned to her fate, or actually accepting of it. And if she leans towards accepting, if this is what pushes Ryu to actually try to start to grow as a character, or if she's resigned, is this finally the gloomy thing that pushes him to act? I couldn't really tell, and I really don't think it matters if I'm being honest, because I think there is a valid point to say that she, as probably most of us in this situation, is an odd mixture of both. She does seem to be completely accepting of her fate. She never has any kind of denial about it. However, this does sometimes cross into the territory of resignation when she, past a reasonable amount of effort, simply concludes that she's going to die in the scenario anyway, so oof, whatever. I do for the record want to state, however, though, that I lean towards her being more accepting than resigned, and even if she does have a lot of lines about avoiding death for today, or not dying in this episode, I think that's more of a testament that she loves her life than a testament that she's completely consumed by its impending end. That she's simply treasuring what days she has, and this would again be in line with the Memento Mori concept established earlier. Gwen has accepted her terminal illness, and so reasons it's best to simply enjoy flying while she can, having achieved some kind of inner peace about her fate and the fact it can't be changed. For this reason, she's always calm and collected, not wanting to waste her time with anxiety, but instead live as relaxed as possible while she can. Gwen knows that panicking's not going to fix anything, and so just doesn't. Now, she still takes her responsibilities seriously, of course, but like Sue, is just kind of happy to be here. Being so calm and collected in turn means that she serves as a sort of glue for the team, often breaking up Dan and Ryu, and reminding everyone to stay in task. And this extension of silent compassion to everyone, even Ryu, makes it arguable that she's kind of the reason he starts to see his teammates as good people, and not just annoying coworkers. One other little thing I want to note about Guinevere is that while it's not revealed until near the end of the series, her attraction to Ryu, for whatever reason, hopes to soften his character and establish a few important narrative points of order. First off, it establishes that Ryu is still capable of some kind of emotion, as he does go out of his way to actually protect her, and on a second point of order, probably more importantly, it also establishes that his obsession with Harriet is more about protecting her, as he failed to protect Maki, to make up for some kind of guilt he has inside of him, than replacing Maki with her. This makes his weird interactions with Harriet at least a little less uncomfortable, and it also shows that he still has something akin to emotions when he seems to genuinely care for Guinevere. I think this is also more well set up than I initially thought, because rewatching the episode where they do the tuning fork thing, it's obvious that she thinks he's kind of cool and is kind of interested in him from the start. So the execution here, while sudden, is passable enough. I mean, sometimes sudden things happen in real life, so I can't fault them. I can't say that this is completely unrealistic, but it is just kind of a little thread that doesn't really go too far in any direction, but does have these relevant notes attached to them. While the relationship between the two is never really fleshed out, I think it is at least a little important, as her acceptance of death also helps Ryu start to accept Maki's death. When it comes to processing loss, Ryu is basically the exact opposite of Gwen, lashing out and seeking someone to hate for his pain. He simply doesn't process it very well, and this is in fact one of the reasons he tries so hard to save Gwen in her episode. Anyways, working alongside someone who accepts their terminal disease, who accepts death as well as Gwen though, makes Ryu start to see her point of view, and while he doesn't come to be like her, he does start to see things more clearly. He isn't fixed or anything, but sees that death comes for everyone and can't be undone, and that's no reason to let it consume your life. He looks at Gwen after all, and someone who knows that they could die at any moment, and sees how she just goes, yeah, and he slowly starts to accept death as a result. Or at least to some extent it could be argued that their interactions help him see this. And this has a serious impact to Gwen's character, and indeed the series as a whole, as it's an important conversation about processing death for a show where almost no one actually dies. Gwen's illness and eventual death are never exploited for morbid edge or emotional shock value or tear-jerking, but instead handled with a very quiet dignity befitting the Memento Mori concept. At no point does Gwen settle around and feel sorry for herself, at no point does she really dwell on her condition, at no point does anyone really ask about it and cry about the fact that she's doomed, and it gets to the point that while the cast is aware of it, no one really even mentions it, to the point where it kind of becomes a problem conveying it to the audience. More on that later. Instead, all her illness really does is serve as a motivation for Gwen to just do what she can while she can. And in this way is kind of an excellent embodiment of the Memento Mori concept. Her illness is not the center of her character though, but instead it's her extreme mental strength and her will to go on that help her handle it. As it's this strength that allows her to process everything so well, it's this strength that allows her to process everything so calmly, and it's this strength that allows her to maintain compassion to those around her who seemingly have it so much better than her. She's never envious of anyone for not having a terminal illness, and she's never bitter about it towards herself or others. Instead, she just handles everything with a serene sense of grace that extends beyond her personality and helps define it. Her grace in the face of her terminal illness and the bonds that she forms along the way become the core of her character, and not just her simple illness. As the Memento Mori, it would be hypocritical to center her character on her disease, so they just don't. And in a series with the superficial gloss of edge present here, I'm very glad that this is how they handled this, and they never even considered using Gwen's condition for the creation of cheap shock value. If there was one criticism for how this is handled though, I think that while Gwen's character evolution and embodiment of Memento Mori is very beautiful, the fact that her character doesn't center on her condition and that no one acknowledges it means that it's kind of hard for the audience to actually pick up, and this is kind of just a little writing nitpick. As it stands, Gwen's terminal illness is not really clear to an audience that doesn't pay 100% attention and make a few educated guesses. Now, I've watched Argento Soma both dubbed and subbed, and both versions kind of force you to assume that she has some kind of chronic illness. It's hinted at with lines like, "Oh, you think it would have showed up in the test results," and stuff like that while she's in the hospital, but it's never directly mentioned and could quite easily be missed if you, I don't know, look away for 30 seconds or so. And at least in my experience, that's a shame, since you kind of have to know about it to truly appreciate her character concept and for it to be truly impactful, for you to truly appreciate the Memento Mori that she is, and for how it as a whole adds a subtle commentary to death that this series kind of lacks without her. Regardless though, her character and her concepts are still very impactful, and a beautiful reminder to be grateful for everything that we do have, and to make the most with our time. That finally gets us to the final supporting member of the funeral team, Commander Lana Iness. While Commander Iness's arc of a cold officer slowly rediscovering her humanity is a little generic, it's still very well done, and a reminder that just because someone seems heartless doesn't mean that they actually are. Indeed, Iness claims to be heartless, only to prove her own statements false as she grows to actually care about Harriet, Frank, and her team, and not just the mission parameters or stated goals. In her, we see a person numbed by adult loss, learning to feel again, and that sometimes feelings are an important component of any decision-making process. She is never the warmest, but it's obvious she starts to outgrow her cold exterior and realize that while her career was and is important, it, indeed no one's career, should be the core of their identity, as humans are much more than that. Like the rest of the funeral team, we first meet Commander Iness upon their capture of Frank. Here we establish that she is a cold but pragmatic commander of the team who sees the objective of stopping an alien advance as her primary one. She isn't necessarily close to anyone, but she does value their input and is at the very least a competent administrator. As the series progresses though, we soon start to see how her interactions with the cast, especially with Harriet and later Frank, slowly start to warm up her cold exterior. This reaches a climax around episode 9, the episode where Harriet runs away inside the facility, where she has to save Harriet's life after Harriet tries to run away due to her emotional pain and trauma. This finally forces Iness to reflect on her own pain, the loss of her daughter quite a few years ago, and to realize that emotions are not something which can be simply buried and hidden away, but instead something that need to be addressed and worked on. That everyone has emotional needs, and that neglecting them is not necessarily the best option. From this point on, she adopts Harriet and becomes a sort of surrogate mother to her, slowly warming up to her and slowly learning to be human again. She sees Harriet, and indeed Frank, as something more than tools to be used, and regrets her eagerness to use the nuclear weapon around Frank's neck that she displayed earlier. As such, she slowly starts to begin to question the setup around her and realize that perhaps the aliens aren't actually acting out of any kind of malignance, that perhaps humanity's own reaction to this unknown factor is what's been causing a lot of the damage. This is later confirmed during the big twist when we find out that Frank and all the aliens are actually just embodiments of the lost astronaut Yuri, and as such, she resolves to make amends by releasing Frank. The army coup stops this, however, and she's taken into custody. However, with the help of Dan Simmons, she does escape and is among those who sees Frank off. After the time skip, it's revealed that she has risen to a position of political power, I believe she's a senator, and is in charge of overseeing the new mission into space, which will send astronauts, including Ryu Soma, to visit the nebula that is the biggest form of Frank, in order to save the world again by communicating to it and not simply trying to destroy it. In many ways, Iness's arc mirrors Ryu's. She's a bitter adult made so by the loss of someone close to her, and buries herself in her work to avoid the emotional fallout of this, and past decisions that she may or may not regret. Both had somewhat strained relationships with the person they lost, even though they cared for them, and the inability to mend this strain before the sudden loss has scarred them for quite a while. In Iness's case, the loss of her daughter makes her realize that perhaps she should have spent more time with her, that perhaps her career isn't everything and she should have taken her family obligations more seriously. This is not because a career prevents someone from having healthy relationships, employment is good, but because prioritizing anything above healthy relationships, in this case her career, is something that will have consequences. Iness is not a bad person for wanting to excel in her field. However, she is simply suffering for placing this urge above her family life, above her personal relationships. She regrets not being closer to her daughter when she had the opportunity, and while this loss would have hurt regardless of how close they were, Iness is left with this gnawing sense of, I should have done more. This of course is very painful, and seeing no point in going back now, Iness just doubles down on the career track. This results in professional excellence and promotion, but it doesn't really fill the hole in her heart, and if anything serves as a constant reminder to how cold she believes herself to be. Something which she embraces because it's kind of the most convenient way of dealing with her pain, and kind of in an unhealthy way reinforces her career path. She doesn't hate herself, but she definitely seems aware that she's made some sacrifices she probably shouldn't have, and allows this knowledge to strip away any warmth she used to have. Thus, by the time we meet Iness, she is a self-professed heartless witch, solely dedicated to getting the job done, and willing to make a good many controversial decisions to do so, whether it's attempting to nuke Frank, or letting a child into an active war zone. She is, by the start of the series, extremely cold, and even unlikable at times. But then Harriet arrives, and Iness slowly starts to remember how to feel again. While initially viewing Harriet solely as a necessary tool to controlling Frank, early objections from Sue and even Heartland raise objective arguments for Iness to be more compassionate towards her. They claim, correctly so, that a happy Harriet is more willing to cooperate and easier to work with than an upset one. However, this doesn't push Iness to compassion quite yet, as by this point she simply sees Harriet as something to be fixed, finally acknowledging her pain as an objective impediment, but seeing it in cold mechanical terms, in a way mirroring how she views her own pain. Now this of course is not sustainable, and eventually Harriet's own struggles are what reawaken Iness's heart. When Harriet attempts to run away and almost falls to her death, Iness is finally forced out of her self-imposed emotional lockout, as she is forced to recognize Harriet's, and by her extension, her own feelings. She's finally forced to realize that she can't just bury everything, and that if she wants to live an objectively good life and be objectively good at her job, she does need to incorporate at least some kind of humanity into both herself and how she performs the tasks at hand. She realizes that Harriet, and by extension herself, have emotional needs, like anyone else, and that neglecting these is not a healthy solution. As such, Iness basically adopts Harriet and slowly relearns motherhood and emotional expression. Now, I'm not going to say that this process is instantly successful, it's not, but it is a slow and steady one, which slowly pushes Iness into listening to her conscience once more and starting to actually question the morality of everything going on. Now that she can feel again, she isn't afraid to question everything, as there's more to her now than simply following orders. And as such, she starts to see the dubious setup around her for what it is. Not only can she feel human again, but she can also see humanity again, and also grows uneasy about Frank's status as a pawn and the questionable militarist push of the world's government. As such, she starts subverting and even defying orders, culminating in trying to release Frank and partaking in her own little rebellion that helps Frank save the world. By the end of the series, in fact, she is an almost entirely new woman, as she, while still very reserved, has come to see communication and connection as paramount instead of simply emotional impulses to be neglected or that get in the way of things. Indeed, I think Iness embodies this idea of communication present in the series very well, in a much more subtle way than many of the main cast. As while she already knew how to communicate with others, she also learns how to communicate with herself and her own feelings. This leads to a brief note on the master of miscommunication, Mr. X/David Lawrence. Now I say miscommunication not because Mr. Lawrence is bad at communicating, but because he hides his true motives in order to forward them. However, while this sounds insidious, it actually sets him up as a surprise hero, and one of Argento Soma's weirdest but most memorable quirks. While I thought that Lawrence was going to be a typical, if very hungry, burn everything down kind of nihilist, he instead is a principled and dedicated friend who disguises himself as a villain to manipulate Ryu into accidentally doing the right thing. Or at least I think that's how that works. I'm gonna be honest, the logistics of everything here are not the best explained or clear. Indeed, some of his actions seem counterintuitive, but it all seems to work out at the end and point to a man with a deep conscience who's been acting on it the whole time. Now we first meet David Lawrence shortly after Ryu is hospitalized, where he somehow gets into his room and goads on his desire to destroy Frank. Eventually he is successful to the point where Ryu takes on his offer to get in the funeral in exchange for spying for Mr. Lawrence. Now, why Mr. Lawrence needs Ryu to spy for him isn't necessarily clear, and neither is what he does with the information that Ryu gives him, but that's just kind of the setup, and it seems like for some reason the information he got was important. He also does check up on Ryu every now and again to remind him of his deal, to eat a snack, and to stoke the flames of hatred a little more in one of several hammy scenes. Once Frank remembers who he was, though, Mr. X drops the act and states his quest of avenging Frank. After this, we also get a brief flashback explaining Mr. Lawrence's past relationship with Yuri/Frank. In the past, David Lawrence was a mission controller for the space program and great friends with Yuri. He received controversial orders to send Yuri into a far-off part of space that resulted in the accident that transformed him into his alien form. As such, Mr. Lawrence cannot forgive himself for actually going through with these controversial orders that he disagreed with from the start, and this is kind of the impetus for his quest. It should also be noted that we get a brief flashback in a different episode explaining that he's Guinevere's uncle, and is how she got into the funeral unit. He then tells Frank of his wife's death and disappears for it. He then reappears to bust the funeral team out of army custody and stall the use of the Ulysses by hacking the government feed long enough for Frank to actually fix the problem. Now he has unfortunately disappeared for this act, at least apparently, but not before he puts a lot of incriminating evidence in an email to the world. He then may or may not appear in the last episode. David Lawrence is a rare example of a twist hero, and this alone sets him apart. It's something very much more rare than the twist villain, and how his arc is integrated into Frank's genuinely makes me think that this decision was decided on from the start, even if a lot of the details were not. There is more to this man than this odd archetype though, and I'd like to briefly touch on that. Although alluding to having no principles, David Lawrence is instead a man driven by them. He cannot forgive himself for deciding to actually give Frank/Yuri the orders that condemned him to his current form, and thus he seeks to avenge him by both helping Frank home and exposing the corrupt members of the military that got the situation started. He in fact dedicates his life to this, rising to the rank of 2-star general in an organization he hates, just to live a life of Burger King bags and obscurity. He then goes out of the way to smear his own character, via the charade he puts on for Ryu, just to get the guy to spy for him. Now again, how this really helps him or his agenda are questionable, but it's obvious that an agenda is here and it seems to have worked, so I'm not going to question the results. Anyways, all of these actions show that this is a guy who's very driven and not really concerned with his own image or pride. He simply wants to try and make things right for his friend whom he lost so long ago. And how he goes about this is, of course, half of his charm, as it's obvious by his love of Shakespeare, half of his dialogues is just quotes from the guy, that Lawrence has a flair for the dramatic, and I really like that they committed to this bit here. While every member of the cast here is either pretty grounded or realistic or moody at times, Lawrence is the one over-the-top anime character that gives a little flair every now and again to the series. He's like a little zing of pepper when he shows up, spicing up his scenes with a fantastic flair that playfully disregards the grounded tone present for most of the show. He's just fun, and I'm glad he turned out to be a twist hero so that we can truly treasure his performances, and his principled heart. While we're on the topic of smaller roles, I also want to briefly talk about Professor Noguchi, as his ideas, even if not himself, are very critical to the show. These ideas take precedence over the man to the point where he's not really important apart from expressing them, in addition to a very few small logistical things. As such, we're going to focus on his ideas for the most part and a few miscellaneous notes afterwards. Now, the ideas that Professor Noguchi constantly trumpets are the need to join the dialogue and to express healthy communication with all of those around us. He's a firm believer in communication and proclaims that while humans are prone to violence and bias, overcoming these via communication is essential to advancing the species as a whole. He wants to know about others, he wants to learn about them, and he wants to do this in order to connect with them and foster constructive interactions and ideas, as these in the long term are much better than simply acting out of fear and misunderstanding. And this theme of the importance of the communication is not just core to Noguchi, but the show as a whole. The entirety of Argento Soma serves as a treatise on the importance of the communication, as embodied by how it facilitates the growth of the cast. As mentioned in the little theme component very early on, this theme is so central to the show that the main characters are intentionally constructed to suck at communication to show just how important it and learning it is. And I don't really want to repeat ad nauseum what has been said already in this retrospective. I just want to say that communication is a central theme of this show, and Dr. Noguchi is the one driving home the importance of plain spoken, open, honest, and constructive dialogue, coming from a place of understanding and openness and not fear and bias. As for Noguchi himself, he's okay. Again, this guy has very little screen time, and while his ideas are critical to the series, he's not really, and I'm gonna be honest, I didn't really care for the man that much, as he seems like kind of a douche. And while we don't see too much of him, I kind of think this might actually be a good thing, as his personality seemed to clash with his noble theories to some extent. If I'm being honest, I think his attitude was a bit of a disservice to the great ideas he conveys, as he comes off as a little abrasive and unlikable at points. But this is just a small nitpick, and we don't really see enough of him for this to really be a problem. It's just something bizarre that I noticed. Alright, I guess I should talk about Takudo/Ryu now. Look, while this guy is the main character here, I'm not going to reserve him the honor of the last character slot, shout out to my man Frank, because quite frankly, Takudo is stubborn, unlikable, immature, irritable, conniving, and many other things. And yet this, in my opinion, is why Takudo is one of the, if not the, most interesting main characters we've ever looked at on this channel. In both the storytelling and meta sense, Takudo is extremely experimental and successful in ways I could never have imagined. He defies almost every rule you would expect a protagonist to abide by, and yet somehow manages to remain at least tolerable enough for us to appreciate just how weird his writing approach is, and just how impactful the morals it's meant to convey are. While he does have an arguably satisfying character arc, his almost glacial pace of growth for large chunks of the story, plus his near-complete lack of a backstory, keep him at arm's length throughout the viewing experience, and yet even without really liking this guy, we can see his fractured psyche and understand his deep, if deeply misguided, pain. Just describing the guy, he seems like he would be completely insufferable. Indeed, he tries hard to be so at points, and yet, somehow, some way, Argento Soma pulls off the writing coup of somehow successfully framing this guy as the MC, a guy who arguably doesn't even really want to be here. It's just insane to me that the main character of a story hates almost everything about that story, including himself, and yet somehow the story is still a coherent and enjoyable one, and his character in it of itself is also coherent. I don't think Takudo himself is the most likable, but the fact that we can tolerate him is proof that Argento Soma as a series is very likable. Now we first meet Takado in episode 1, when he, after a spat with Maki, helps her help Professor Noguchi to reanimate Frank. This of course gets Maki killed, and Takado misinterprets Frank's failed attempt to protect her as a deliberate and malicious act. Their last conversation ended on an unpleasant note, and Takado will, for the majority of the series, be haunted by this lack of closure and, the whole fact she's dead. Takado then wakes up in the hospital, where David Lawrence eventually convinces him to join funeral to avenge Maki, and also spy for the very hungry man. Oh, and he also has these cool anime scars now, which, while mostly cosmetic, do reflect on his new two-sided nature and the duality of this sensitive man who's driven to toxic behaviors simply because he craves connection but doesn't know how to establish that. Anyways, getting back to the plot, now as a funeral pilot and spy, remember he's literally Two-Face now, Ryu partakes in various missions, all the while attempting to get Frank killed and even trying to do the deed himself a few times. Along the way, he paradoxically tries to help Harriet deal with her new living situation by giving out brutally honest, but pretty well-intentioned life advice, and assuring her that Frank will be okay. In spite of his hatred of Frank, he partakes in various missions alongside the robot and even saves him when the greater good demands it, i.e. when allowing Frank to die would also get everyone else killed, and he later partakes in the mission to revive Frank, and it's here that he supposes that maybe Frank didn't actually mean to hurt Maki when Frank in similar circumstances saves Harriet. This, and other questioning before and after this event, slowly starts to cause Takado to lose his grip on reality as his hate-filled worldview starts to fall apart. Eventually, he even starts to confuse Harriet with Maki on occasion, and lashes out at her for, quote, not appreciating his efforts. Once Takado learns Frank's true identity, and that he definitely actually tried to save Maki, his hate-based worldview completely shatters, and he's eventually forced to realize that maybe he's not justified in all of his feelings, and maybe he's just lashing out. This eventually results in him being the one to awaken Frank during the Battle of the Base. He initially tries to do this by simply yelling at the robot, his patented default technique. However, when all this does is upset Harriet, he then yells at her instead. It's only when she literally tells him that he never listens and that that's his problem that he finally realized that, maybe that is his problem, and one of the main reasons he sucks at socializing and therefore is filled with constant loneliness. He then has a big epiphany where he realizes that his hatred of Frank is really just hatred of himself and his loneliness, and that in some ways he even identified with Frank, as like him, he felt like he could never communicate with those around him. This is what finally arouses Frank and gets him to save the world. A now moved Takado then hands Harriet off to Gwen, she fainted right before Frank ascended, and turns himself in the jail for espionage. Cut to 6 years later in the final episode, he's pardoned, and upon briefly returning to his apartment, finally receives an email that Maki sent right before her death, which simply states, "Thank you." This gives him closure, and he finally seems somewhat whole again. He then joins the Ulysses in space, as it seeks to communicate with Nebula Frank, having seemingly turned over a new leaf and started a new chapter in his life. Takado is a man defined by hate, although not the hate that we expect on the surface level. While he is hateful towards Frank and lives in a general sense of disdain, most of his hatred is actually just redirected self-loathing, stemming from his own loneliness. Takado is an extremely lonely man who loathes himself for his own shortcomings and flaws, especially his inability to connect with others, and not really knowing how to process this, he seeks validation from the company of others to try and help with this. However, he genuinely seems unaware of how to talk to people or empathize with them at all, and this friction results in a lot of frustration, which causes a lot of toxic behaviors that he blames others for. Whether he's yelling at Maki to smile in a flashback or doing the same to Harriet in real time, Takado is seemingly oblivious to the fact that you can't simply brute force happiness upon someone, and that he isn't owed other people's happiness. He seems to view emotions in an extremely mechanical and robotic manner, and while acknowledging that they exist, cannot comprehend the idea that they can't simply be adjusted like one might tighten a bolt. This of course causes an extreme amount of friction in his relationships, as they tend to be rather unpleasant or at least distant. He associates any kind of criticism or questioning or even emotional uncertainty as a direct attack on his person. It's no surprise that socializing is extremely difficult for him, and as such, he gets even more frustrated as he expects others to appreciate his efforts in this, even if said efforts are often misguided and come off as aggressive or unpleasant. He simply sees the fact that he made an effort as something that should credit validation, not appreciating the fact that the wrong effort is almost as bad, if not worse, than no effort most of the time. A sufficient lack of appreciation, in turn, which Takado defines as a lack of blanket happiness, frustrates the man even more and results in his immature, often toxic behaviors. At first, Maki puts up with this, and this seems to draw at least a little good out of the guy, but her sudden death strips Takado of the one outlet he felt he had, and he doesn't understand how to socialize enough to get another outlet, and arguably no one wants to with him after a certain point anyways. I mean, would you want to hang out with this guy? The guy who gets upset at you for being uncomfortable with him as he tries to yell you into happiness? No, I didn't think so. Now, quick note about Ryu and Harriet, which we'll talk about more in the Harriet section. Ryu's obsession with Harriet, while very weird, I don't think is malignant. You see, I think he sees Maki in her, but not in the way that you might think. He sees an innocent being that he wants to protect, and him trying to protect Harriet is more about trying to succeed in this endeavor that he failed with Maki. Now, he does blame himself to some extent for Maki's death, and the fact that their last conversation was an unpleasant one is not helpful. This in turn sets up Harriet as a sort of second chance in Ryu's eyes, as protecting her would, to some extent, make up for his, quote, failure to protect Maki, especially considering that, in his eyes, they are exposed to the same danger of Frank. Now, Frank, of course, is not dangerous at all, we know this, but again, Ryu hates the guy and thinks he is, so it would make sense that he tries to stick close to Harriet in order to just kind of keep an eye on Frank, whom he's very suspicious of. This does also mean, though, that Ryu comes off as really weird and kind of creepy at points, because he does seem to obsess over Harriet to an unreasonable degree, and while giving her good life advice at some point, is also seemingly petty and jealous of Frank for her attention at different points of the series. However, all of this is more of a reflection of his own guilt and self-loathing than some weird attempt to fully substitute Maki with Harriet. This is also supported by him accepting Guinevere's advances. The fact of the matter is that Takado is unpleasant not because he seeks to be, but because he is astronomically self-unaware and insensitive and insecure. I don't really think he wants to be a problem at his core, but he can't help but manifest problematic social relationships stemming from his low self-esteem and inability to connect and empathize with others. I want to point out that even as he grows a tad throughout the series, even opening up for a moment near the end, he's never super close to anyone other than maybe Gwen for like 10 minutes. Everyone else just kind of gives the guy space because they see him as that guy. He genuinely seems to push people away and is genuinely unpleasant around most people most of the time. He even does this in the penultimate episode, walking away from everyone and then just going straight to prison for 6 years. It gets to the point where Takado's frustration consumes not only his own relationships with others, but even the relationship he has with himself, his self-view, as the isolation and pent-up aggression he feels arguably break his psyche. At first, his misguided revenge quest is enough to force his grief-shattered mind back together, but as evidence against his biases reaches a critical mass, he's eventually forced to realize how misguided he was, and that he didn't actually accomplish much of anything, simply crashing out for no really justified purpose. I don't say this to invalidate his pain, merely to say that how he processed that pain was often extremely immature and unhealthy, and his refusal to acknowledge this and try to grow out of that for most of the series is even more unhealthy. He simply doesn't want to acknowledge how wrong he was, and he just can't until a literal life or death situation forces him to. None of his relationships are super healthy, and his growth doesn't even conclude in him really fixing them, just finally realizing why this is the case. He finally realizes that maybe some of his issues with socializing are things on his end and not entirely the fault of others. That maybe people don't like you if you exhibit toxic behaviors, and that maybe the loneliness and self-esteem issues that frustrate him are to some extent partially his fault and related to a self-loathing he's too afraid to fully acknowledge and healthily address. Does he act upon this epiphany? I don't know. Probably. I mean, he seems to be much more well-adjusted in the last episode, but it's not like we see a lot of him there, so I'm just gonna take his massive epiphany at face value and say he finally found some kind of peace, and that finally reading Maki's email hopefully helped set him on the right path. All of this is to say that for an anime protagonist, Takado is remarkably stagnant and set in his ways, even if he does eventually seem to learn some kind of lesson. And while it may seem like I just spent the last couple minutes roasting the guy, because I kind of did, everything I just cited is why Takado fascinates me as a main character. It takes an extremely skilled writing hand to construct a character like Takado, one who is extremely flawed and often unlikable, and have that be the main character. It forces the writing team to walk a tightrope between maintaining the character's flaws and questionable actions, and making sure the viewer doesn't actively despise them. For as insufferable as Takado can be at times, I actually don't hate the guy, and I find his story to be very compelling, even if I don't really relate to him. I can see that he's clearly a very angry man, but the fact that most of his pain comes from a very deep sense of loss and pain does help me accept this to a large extent. I can see that he has very misguided views, but that he still does the right things, at least some of the time, helps balance that out. I can see that he's a very flawed man, but that his flaws run so deep that he can't even see them makes him interesting in some weird, bizarre way. I can clearly see someone absolutely despising this guy, but I can't. And the fact of the matter is that because Takado is human. He's not the most likable human, but he is definitely human, flaws and all, and his unbiased and even savage portrayal here remind us of the ups and downs that the species is capable of. It reminds us that no one is perfect, and that perhaps we can take inspiration from the flawed just as much as we can from the perfect. It's a statement that you don't necessarily need a perfect character to write a near-perfect story. Even the logistics of Takado in this way are unique, as he manifests an extremely unique approach to writing, considering that we never even really get to know him before the accident. That is to say, we never get to know who this man was, and therefore may have never gotten to even know the quote, real Takado. Instead, we only meet this scarred Takado post a very traumatic event, who, for all we know, may actually be a very twisted reflection of what could have been a very sweet and caring man. Now, full stop, I think the show does a good point of proving he was not sweet or caring, as evidenced by the various flashbacks we see him in, but there is this kind of sense that we never got to know him beforehand, and this adds mystery to his character, and thrusts us into this voyage of discovery alongside him. It forces us to throw our lot in with the seeming lunatic, and content ourselves with the fact that there is some interesting stuff here. This generates a decent amount of sympathy towards the character, enough to ease at least some of the rough edges, and a lot of mystery which keeps us curious as to who he really is, even if we can't entirely answer that by the end of the series. As while he does have a lot of screen time, he maintains his distance with us just as much as he maintains it with other characters, and while this can be seen as irritating and does contribute to his stagnancy, since that is something that they seem to have gone with from the start, and I think it's well executed here. Takado was fascinating because in many ways, he is the exact opposite of the generic anime protagonist. While anime has a trope of friendship saving the day, Takado is actively unfriendly. While anime has a trope about reaching out to others and forming bonds, Takado actively isolates himself and refuses to make even trivial attempts at bonding with others for much of the series. While anime has tropes about pushing one's limits and never settling, Takado refuses to acknowledge any of his flaws and is basically trapped by his own limitations for a majority of the series. He is initially unlikable, immature, irritable, standoffish, and so many other things, and even fails to learn as Frank helps him and those around him give him so many chances to. While one might criticize him for all of these things though, I think that's the point here, and the somewhat slow pace of the show in general, which gives him so many, often missed, chances to learn, make his eventual epiphany to be surprisingly satisfying. Like, even if you hate Takado, I can see this ending still being satisfying, because at the very least, the guy finally learned his lesson and completed something resembling a character arc. While one might again criticize his lack of a very deep arc, I think his point is that he's mired in his own pain, and that him coming out of it is still big enough to consider something of an arc. He's incredibly unique for a protagonist, as he's neither some moral wonderkind or even benevolent. In fact, he's actively unpleasant, and yet he doesn't go far enough in this to be a generic, effortlessly cool or overpowered or edgy anime protagonist either. He's just an extremely unstable man and a very visceral portrayal of raw humanity, with a lot of flaws. And somehow, through skilled writing, he eventually works his way through his feelings, even if getting carried away by them now and again, to become an extremely memorable and arguably successful, obscure anime protagonist. That gets us to Harriet, the emotional core of Argento Soma and arguably the actual main character. Now, the decision to forego the typical anime wunderkind for an actual child is one of the bizarre reasons Argento Soma works so well, as in this case, it greatly humanizes everyone involved, all the while providing an excellent coming-of-age element to the story. Now, that's not to trivialize Harriet or her actual character growth, it's just to say that in both a narrative sense and in a more personal character sense, Harriet is an excellent addition to the story. Indeed, Harriet's tale is rather tragic when we zoom out, but how she overcomes all of the odds while maintaining her purity of heart are an uplifting and optimistic counterweight to whatever the hell Ryu's up to. That's not to say her path is an easy one, it's definitely not, but perhaps that's why it's so rewarding and impactful. We can clearly see the stressful situation she's in, the pain she experiences, especially early on when her PTSD is untreated, and we just want her to be okay. And eventually she is, all the while reminding those around her that they can be okay too. And this is why Harriet is arguably the most important character in the entirety of Argento Soma, even if technically not the main character. She's important because she reminds everyone of their heart and of their potential for growth, making the entire cast much more accessible. If not for her, Argento Soma would be a much more dreary show, as it would lack the simple innocence and understanding Harriet brings, as well as the dialogue with Frank that she begins. Her presence, through trauma and all, essentially forces the cast to lighten up, and to actually be empathetic and learn to connect with others, and to see that doing so is important. It's a great reminder that the past doesn't determine the future, as this scared young girl grows up to be a successful astronaut, and she above all probably most embodies the natural growth of dialogue, as her own dialogue advances throughout the series, and the ways in which she communicates with Frank, and indeed eventually gets him to communicate with others, develops greatly throughout the series. Now we first meet Harriet in episode 2, where she lives a quiet life with her grandfather and dog Walton in the mountains of Montana. One day, while playing outside, she encounters Frank in a lake. On the same day she meets Frank, though, she and her grandfather are harassed by these guys who want the two to move so that they can sell the land or something. They end up pursuing Harriet to the lake, where they see this other alien, and in a panic, one of them tries to shoot the alien, triggering a defensive response. This endangers everyone, though Frank does act in a timely enough manner to save Harriet, who was rendered immobile by the deep PTSD that gunshots trigger in her. Not actually wanting to hurt anyone, he extends his arm to her, and they are whisked away to Funeral HQ. In this new, startling environment, an upset Harriet longs to go somewhere happier. At first she asks Frank to take her to Fairyland. When this proves impossible, she asks him to take her home. Upon finding nothing there anymore though, she receives a talk from Ryu explaining that she has nowhere else to go, and she needs to accept this, and that they gotta go back fast if Walton is to survive the bullet wound he received from the pilot who fired a gun on Frank. They do save the dog. Anyways, after that, Harriet still tries to run off though, still feeling alone and isolated in Funeral HQ, though this time she doesn't even make it off the base, instead almost falling to her death, and finally making the team realize that she's more than just a tool. As such, Iness essentially adopts her, and she does start to make progress overcoming her post-traumatic stress, as she's now finally treated like a human, and it's finally understood that she needs help and understanding, and not just orders. It's also revealed in this episode that the reason Harriet can communicate with Frank at all is because of a piece of alien metal lodged within her brain as a result of the first invasion. Parallel to this personal plot, of course, is the bigger plot of Harriet acting as Frank's link to the team, and essentially his air traffic controller, as the two help them fight the aliens and slowly integrate themselves into the greater team. With Frank's death and re-resurrection, Harriet spends more time trying to help him relearn how to talk, something that actually happens when he makes it to Pilgrimage Point. And this kicks off the final arc in the Battle of the Base, where Harriet sneaks in and helps awaken Frank by finally making Ryu understand his own issues. She does this by telling him that he never listens, and that people actually need to listen to each other. This, and probably the miracle that Ryu actually learns something, inspires Frank to save the world. As he does, the piece of metal leaves Harriet's brain, and, sad to lose him, she faints. In the final episode, it's revealed that in the 6 years preceding, she was a camp counselor for fellow orphans of the Alien Wars, and that she is now an astronaut, ready to head out to space and reconnect with her long-lost friend. Like Ryu, Harriet's character construction is an unorthodox but highly successful balancing act, In this case, the writers had the balance between maintaining a realistic level of trauma-induced behaviors and, quote, normal, innocent child behaviors, all the while constructing a sort of coming-of-age arc. They show enough of her pain to let us know that she needs help, and to make the cast realize the same. But they never exploit this, informing that the trauma she has isn't the entirety of her character, and that she's still an innocent child and simply wants to be one. The pain opens up important conversations about dealing with loss and emotional pains, and the innocence reminds us that there's still potential to overcome these pains, and that they don't need to consume us. In fact, Harriet portrays this to all of us so well that Ryu actually manages to learn from her to some extent, even if it takes him forever. Now, while starring a child may be a kiss of death for your production, look at the Phantom Menace, they clearly knew what they were doing here, as Harriet is both grounded enough to seem realistic and endear her to both to the cast and to the audience, and yet pained and traumatized enough to make her growth truly inspiring. On the topic of that development, Harriet's entire arc is based on two things: the recovery from her pain, and later, once more stable, starting to learn about her responsibilities as a sole one capable of communicating with Frank, and indeed embracing these responsibilities. Now, I will say that these arcs are somewhat uneven, as the PTSD plot point is kind of dropped after she's essentially adopted by Iness, but they do take their time up until this point explaining the mechanics of it and showing that it is a real issue beforehand. Indeed, we should note that while it's not really brought up past her adoption, this point also coincides with a sort of paradigm shift where the funeral team actually starts to view and treat Harriet as a person and not just how a tool. It's funny how that actually helps someone's mental state. Anyways, this kind of proceeds into Harriet's second arc, where, now much more comfortable, she naturally starts to outgrow her more childish tendencies, slowly starting to phase out the name Mr. Fairy in favor of the much more professional Frank, and starting to view herself as actually part of the team. Now, while this may sound like she's simply more comfortable around everyone, it's important to notice that this does also coincide with her accepting and indeed embracing more responsibility in her role as communicator. No longer just advocating for Frank because she sees him as sort of a security blanket, but also because she sees him as a genuine friend and someone who is also genuinely part of the team. In the few episodes where Frank starts to communicate with the team via radio, she truly starts to embrace this responsibility of being his speaker, and past this point has truly become his sort of advocate. She's learned a lot and eventually even teaches a lot too, as she's the one who finally manages to get Ryu to understand that he's kind of a dick for more than 2 seconds. In fact, she learns so much by overcoming her pain that she helps Ryu start to do that himself, and their relationship is really weird, as he kind of sees Maki in her, but not in a weird romantic sense, I don't think. Instead, I think he just sees this innocent person who he worries about because they're innocent. While Ryu is a rather unpleasant character, I think his concern for Harriet is mostly wholesome from what I can tell, and that he genuinely just doesn't want to see another innocent person killed for unjustified reasons. In this way, she sort of coaxes Ryu's humanity back out of him, intentional or otherwise, and as the only person who's willing to stand up to him and say that he's an a-hole to his face, I think she serves as an important sort of mirror to the guy, even if he doesn't want to look in it for the majority of the series. In this way, Harriet's also very critical to the narrative flow and structure of Argento Soma. As noted in the Takado section, that guy kinda sucks, so Harriet is forced in some situations, especially before Frank regains speech, to serve as a more conventional viewer surrogate and protagonist. As a surrogate, she's excellent, as we want to see this young orphan make it through everything okay. Other than a piece of metal in her brain, she really doesn't have any powers or abilities, so it's obvious that there's stakes here, and that we can't just expect her to work her way through everything via some magical power she has. In a more grounded sense, her status as an outsider and a child also mean that she's much more likely to ask relevant questions the viewer might have. In terms of character growth, she also greatly surpasses Takado, as while that guy is largely static, Harriet's arc of her overcoming her traumas is quite inspiring and shows actual character growth. It shows an actual person learning that they can't run away from their pain, and that they actually need to address it directly in some way. Now, this is ironically told to Harriet by Takado, but it is advice that she genuinely seems to take the heart, and we can see that after her first 3 attempts running away, she has learned that she needs to just kind of face things head on and slowly start to come to terms with things, which she does throughout the course of the series. And there's even an obvious shift in her dialogue and actions, showing how she starts to accept the ways of the world. In the early episodes, she thinks Frank is an actual fairy and that fairyland is a real place and that she wants to go there. By episode 24, she no longer believes this, and instead sees befriending and even advocating Frank as an important responsibility that she can bear. She has gone from the one that he protects to, in a way, sort of protecting him. If not in a physical sense, then by advocating for him and proving that he is something more than just a hunk of metal. Harriet's close bond with Frank also conveys important messages about communicating and overcoming biases. In fact, as the only one that can communicate with him at first, she's critical to getting this ball rolling and is indeed even very powerful in an indirect way. Let me put it this way. Argento Soma is all about the power of communication, and Frank is a very physically powerful guy. In fact, he could easily 1v1 anyone here, and as only Harriet has the ability to talk to him early on, it's therefore arguable that Harriet has more power than almost anyone else here. It's not her power per se, but the fact that she can indirectly wield it is a testament to the non-physical power of communication, and indeed the massive amount of strength it can bring to bear when properly utilized. Now, when I say properly utilized, this connects to the other point that Harriet brings up, and that is the fact that her childish innocence lends credence to the fact that dialogue can only be truly constructive when we approach it without overbearing biases. Consider the fact that even if everyone could communicate with Frank from episode 1, Harriet's probably the only one who would actually trust and believe him. Takeda would call him a liar, and everyone else would probably jump between confused and suspicious. It's only the absence of these things within Harriet's heart, it's only within the absence of unfounded biases that she can actually have a truly meaningful discussion with Frank, and proves that if we want to do the same, we need to leave our biases aside, that we need to actually accept others as people and try to listen to them and engage them in constructive conversations, listening to what they have to hear in addition to trying to say what we want to say. And Harriet does this, both listening to Frank and talking to him in such an open and pure-hearted way. And it is this pure heart and it is this open communication that Harriet embodies that truly make Argento Soma what it is, a heartwarming tale about learning to connect with others and overcoming the great barriers that may seemingly be between us. And it's for this reason that Harriet is truly the heart of Argento Soma. That finally gets us to the case of Frank/Yuri, the most conventionally heroic of the main protagonists, and yet the one with the least dialogue. If Takeda is some kind of bizarre experiment in writing a new kind of anti-hero, and Harriet is a more conventional story of growing up, Frank is a take on a somewhat standard hero archetype done in a rather odd way. He has a tragic past resultant of his bold heart, and yet this gives him power which his heart sees him use for the best. He is caring, mature, and selfless, and while these may sound generic, how Frank is presented is not, and this is why he's not a generic protagonist, because he doesn't say anything for more than half the series. He literally doesn't talk for more than half the series. However, this is not an issue at all though, as relating to Frank is very easy. His actions speak volumes about his character, even if his past, motivations, and even identity are unclear for a greater part of the series. We don't hear him speak at all early on, but from episode 2, we do want the best for him and we can clearly tell that he is a good guy. If anything, this lack of dialogue creates a lot of intrigue around Frank, as we seek to learn about him and his motivations and ideals, and this makes his eventual speech all the more impactful, regardless of whether or not you like the twist of his identity. Now, Frank is first introduced in episode 1, as he is resurrected by the morgue team under Dr. Noguchi. This is unfortunately sabotaged though, and in the resultant accident, Frank's failed attempt to save Maki only gets Takeda to blame him for her death for the entirety of the series. This does cause a lot of friction. Anyways, scarred by this incident, Frank then flees to Montana, where he meets Harriet for the first time and saves her from this other alien. The two then start to bond as Frank feels he must protect this young orphan, and said orphan views Frank as her new magical protector and best friend. What results is a few misadventures where Frank whisks Harriet away to the city, resulting in a battle that convinces Takado to join Funeral, as well as a second, later misadventure where he takes her back to the ruins of her old home, inadvertently convincing her that she does kind of have to move on. Parallel to this, of course, is the main plot of Frank starting to assist the Funeral team in their fights with other aliens, and while they are at first very weary of him being on the battlefield, Frank soon starts to gain their trust, as he proves to be very reliable and upstanding, not even minding the fact that they do put a bomb around his neck for quote-unquote insurance. Following the fight with the really big alien, Frank is out of commission for a bit, although he is successfully re-resurrected at the old morgue building, and from here he starts to regain the ability to speak, though at this point only via a radio. When the military starts to meddle with Funeral and tells them to stand down so that the Tote unit can take care of an alien, Frank is called into action one last time to bail them out as they fail to stop that alien from approaching Pilgrimage Point. He does succeed, but he makes it there instead, and the sight of it finally brings back his memories. You see, Frank was once Yuri Leonov, a famed cosmic explorer who was thought to be lost forever. In reality, though, he was sucked into some kind of cosmic space oddity beyond comprehension, and this transformed him into his current alien form. This also explains why they all had the Pilgrimage Point, because Yuri was just trying to go home to see his wife all these years. Even if he couldn't put that into words, he had this underlying and deep instinctual urge to see her again. Unfortunately though, tragically, he cannot, however, as David Lawrence shows up to greet him and informs him that his wife died in an alien-related event. This revelation causes Frank to emotionally shut down, and he enters a catatonic state of grief as the Funeral team is forced to airlift him away so that he is not caught up in the nuclear bombing of Pilgrimage Point. He remains in this state until during the battle for the base, when Takado and Harriet finally manage to remind him that there is some good at people, and he once again saves the day by absorbing all the alien particles in the world and flying into space to destroy the alien the size of the Earth before it can get close enough to cause any damage. There is no end to Frank though, as there is no end to dialogue, and this may or may not result in the creation of an even bigger Frank heading for Earth 6 years later, which Harriet and Ryu once again hope to establish a dialogue with. Now, while having a character that doesn't talk for a majority of your series about communication may seem odd, Frank is great, as he is great proof that there are forms of communication beyond simple talking, and that maintaining a healthy relationship is more than just giving lip service to the idea of that. While Takado is physically able to communicate but emotionally unable to, Frank is the exact opposite, and yet the fact that we're able to relate to him and clearly tell that he is a good guy prove this point, that there is more to communication than just talking. There's intentions and mindset and your actions reflecting upon these, and his steadfast actions buy him the benefit of the doubt, and eventually the chance to prove himself to those who doubted him. While there is a point here about how no one listens or even tries to listen to Frank at first, there's also a much greater point about how Frank manages to convince them to listen based on his own conduct, the exact opposite of Takado. Where Takado would lash out and give up almost immediately upon not finding satisfactory emotional validation, I guess, failing to appreciate the feelings of others, Frank, by contrast, is extremely patient and considerate of others, seeming to consider their feelings in almost everything he does. He, to some extent, either understands, or at least doesn't seem to mind, that others may have biases against them, and he doesn't let this sour his own actions. He knows that the conduct of others should not be the sole thing justifying the conduct of oneself. He has suffered more than anyone else here. Remember, he was lost in space for years, accidentally killed his wife, and is repeatedly killed by his own kind, even forced to kill manifestations of himself, and yet none of this makes him bitter, as he doesn't seek revenge, he only seeks to see his wife again, and even the revelation that he can't do this doesn't crush his indomitable spirit. As while even learning of this great tragedy, he doesn't lash out at others, instead being justifiably depressed, and even through this, still managing to step up when really needed. Like Heartland, Frank is a great example of a positive and protective and measured masculinity that puts others first and conducts itself along some kind of moral guidelines. As even in the depths of despair and threats from others, Frank stays true to his ideals and is never tempted by the allure of revenge. He doesn't hold anything against anybody, and even thanks them for eventually learning an important lesson about reaching out to others and not judging them simply for being different. As a result, even though Frank cannot talk most of the series, The team seems to warm up to him much faster than Takado, and they genuinely see him as one of them, past the point, well, Takado was still just that guy. In a broader scope, the entire identity of Frank takes themes present in many alien invasion works to their logical extreme. Now, there are usually two kinds of alien invasion works. Many works of this genre focus on an actual threat, threatening people and humanity working against that. But then there's also a sort of subset of this genre which focuses on the purported danger of, quote, others, and why such suppositions aren't always correct and often destructive. They touch on the idea that often the fear of an attack can be just as dangerous as an attack, especially if you're lashing out at something or someone simply for being unknown. Now here, these themes are extenuated by the fact that Frank wasn't even a quote-unquote other. I mean, at some point he is still just some guy, and the fact that he isn't recognized as an intelligent and sensitive being is typical of this kind of subgenre of alien invasion works, but the irony of his identity really drives it home and makes his selfless nature even more impressive. It makes it so that I really don't mind the twist, as it does a really good job pushing this point, even if it does kind of undo the surface level premise. While Frank is the most conventional hero we have in terms of temperament and ideals, all of the packaging around this still cement him as a rather experimental and interestingly constructed protagonist. His inability to talk puts his life in the hands of those around him, both emphasizing their own ideas and the danger he's in. While Frank may seem too powerful to be in danger, we must consider that if Harriet hadn't advocated for him from the start, he probably would have been put down just like every other alien, and they do put a literal H-bomb around his neck. Now, Frank may be very physically powerful, but like Takado, he's still very vulnerable because he cannot effectively communicate early on. The only difference is that Frank is physically vulnerable, while Takado is emotionally vulnerable. Frank is vulnerable because he cannot talk for himself, he cannot articulate words to prove that he is a gentle and kind soul, and him slowly regaining higher speech abilities is therefore very rewarding as we see him finally able to speak for himself and overcome this great communicative gap and unfortunate weakness that he has to deal with at the start of the series. This is even more impactful when we actually consider how little Frank actually says, as even past making it to Pilgrimage Point, there isn't a lot of screen time for him past this point, so he still doesn't say that much in terms of volume. I think all the speeches he gives are his backstory, his pain and loss, and his thanks to everyone as he leaves to save the world. And yet in these few words, he still tells us all we need to know about him and a lot of his great moral points. He still says everything he needs to say. Like the series himself, once Frank starts talking, he gets right to the point, and again opposite of Takado, actually uses his words very well to drive his points home. Frank's limited dialogue is only the final step in transitioning Frank from a thing to a person though, as a great job is done building up to this point. As soon as we first meet him, we can tell that there is something here, but there's still a little bit of room to question how intelligent Frank is, as we can perceive he understands Harriet, but her words are quite simple, and we can't tell if he really comprehends it or just kind of goes off of instinct. As we see more of him though, we start to perceive much more of a personality and individuality, as it's obvious he is motivated and has his own way of doing things. Past this point, we then start to see the emergence of morality and ethics, especially exemplified when he overlooks Takado's numerous attempts to kill him, sometimes even directly. Frank starts to seemingly evolve before our eyes, manifesting more and more signs of intelligence, except for verbal communication. Him finally doing so is the bow on top of this mounting mountain of evidence that he is both intelligent and noble in character. In the meantime, the lack of dialogue creates a genuinely engaging experience as we try to determine how and to what extent Frank thinks. The series eventually does straight up tell how and what Frank thinks. I mean, the man does so himself during one of his dialogues, but this reveal helps push Frank fully from the great example of a tragic monster, obviously a good guy but very misunderstood, to a full-blown noble hero. Tying back to the book that this may have taken inspirations from, Frank is truly a Frankenstein creation, made of many disparate parts, and this distinguishes him as a quote-unquote monster. He is trapped in this liminal state of being, owing humanity for his life again, and yet also the victim of their unfounded beliefs and fear of something different. Yet unlike in that book, Frank, with Harriet's help, is eventually able to break through these prejudices and prove his noble character. He is able to break the archetype that he is cast into and prove that we can all do the same. We see this most in his odd relationship with Takado, who both kind of created him and definitely hates him. This relationship is the core of the series, and I choose to bring it up here and not in the Takado section because it's really a credit to Frank and not Takado. I also want to say that on a surface level, Frank's and Takado's arcs are actually surprisingly parallel. When you think about it, they're both men who kind of inadvertently killed their significant other after having a big disagreement with them. Yuri accidentally became Frank, which accidentally got his wife killed, and Takado accidentally assisted in Maki's death when he helped resurrect Frank in his current form. The only difference between the two, though, is how they really handle it, where Takado is kind of in denial the whole time and unable to accept the state of affairs. Frank/Yuri is much more reserved about it, and willing to flat up just admit he is wrong, that he messed up, and that he is the one that is at least somewhat partially responsible for the course of events. We see this when he admits to acting foolishly and not appreciating his wife all that he could have when he returns to his home at Pilgrimage Point. Something that Takado, while probably feeling, would never say, at least not at his current maturity levels. And we see this in the fact that he always blames Frank or others for his pains, and that he always blames others for not being happy in spite of his best efforts to make them happy, no matter how misguided or questionable those efforts may be. This may also explain why Frank tolerates Takado to the extent he does, perhaps not only doing so simply because he's a very patient man, but also because he may see parts of his younger self inside Takado. Perhaps he sees the same impulsiveness and drive that inadvertently led him astray and inadvertently got his wife killed. Perhaps he wants Takado to come to the same realization that he has, that sometimes it's best to simply admit you're wrong in order to fully come to terms with whatever's going on. That you can't live in denial, that you can't constantly pull the wool over your own eyes, and that you have to admit that sometimes the circumstances you find yourself in are partially your fault, and it's up to you to healthily try and improve the situation as best you can. Frank is hated by the man who helped make him because that man is consumed by his own pain and simply seeks a scapegoat. But Frank does not reciprocate this hate, simply choosing to ignore it the best he can and prioritize what he truly thinks is important, taking care of Harriet and returning home. Both characters are kind of stagnant when we zoom out, but the fact that Frank can go from a sort of generic tragic monster to a sort of generic full-blown noble hero does show a good amount of character evolution in some kind of abstract writing sense, and the fact that Frank stays a good guy at all, in spite of Takado's constant bullying and badgering, is a testament to him and his strong moral backbone, as Frank's noble actions essentially eventually force Takado to realize that his own positions and his own views are untenable. As such, Frank proves Takado wrong by just taking the high road and essentially doing nothing, and while not needing to redeem himself, Frank certainly would have simply by these actions, proving that often actions can communicate louder than words, and how one conducts himself is an important part of any dialogue, and that bridging the gap between others with dialogue is, of course, essential. And that finally brings us to the conclusion of the Argento Soma retrospective. While Argento Soma is an undeniably weird series, its bizarre construction and unique character decisions mask a relatively simple and charming piece which is pretty accessible and very impactful, at least in my eyes. This, as well as its place at the tail end of an era of the medium, set Argento Soma apart as an accidental, unintentional swan song for 90s hand-drawn mech. Now, I obviously don't think it was supposed to be this, or even really some big hit, or avant-garde ascent to glory. No, I think when Argento Soma was made, it was just supposed to be a charming little piece built around a simple theme, a few big twists, and some unique protagonists. And yet this earnest construction is the exact reason why Argento Soma is so meaningful to me. It feels genuine because it is, and its messages feel meaningful because they are. Yes, it has clunky moments and edge at points, and I will be the first to admit that the quality control here is a little fluid at points, but it's these irregularities that help distinguish it as a rearguard of the hand-drawn 90s pieces before new styles, new levels of quality control, and even new forms of animation itself would usher in a completely new era that many of us grew up in. No, Argento Soma is among the last of the pieces in the era preceding that, an era that was more quaint and that tended to put story and vision above all, even if it meant that some things didn't always make sense and some things weren't the most linear. It was a piece that never tried to be the best thing ever, and it never tried to be the newest or most innovative thing ever. It simply tried and succeeded at being itself. And that's why I titled the video what I did, because the beauty of Argento Soma, and indeed so many other animes of this era, lie in how genuine they feel. It's very quaint, for lack of a better term, and although bizarre, still serves as a sort of microcosm for the era that spawned it. An era when a lack of production resources created some questionable frames, but often forced stories and storytelling and writing to compensate for this. When stories simply sought to be just that, to simply say what they wanted and needed to say, and to captivate us not only with their visuals, but also with their heart. Maybe it's because of this that Argento Soma is so dear to me, because this is the first series retrospective I've completed since doing both the Gungrave and Requiem for Phantom videos, and while those series are amazing, they're not the brightest or most happy, but Argento Soma could be considered so, and its heart just means so much to me, and I hope it means a lot to you too, whether it's its heartwarming characters or its timeless message, because for me, Argento Soma's heart is the true beauty of this amazing, obscure anime memory.